Blood hit the floor before the screaming started. 1 second, the emergency department of Harlow Valley Medical Center was routine chaos. Gurneys rattling, monitors beeping, a drunk man arguing with a triage nurse about his wait time. The next second, a masked man in a tactical vest walked through the sliding glass doors with a rifle across his chest and put a bullet through a police detective's shoulder like he was checking off a task on a list. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And in the back supply corridor, a blonde nurse with flour on her sleeve from the break room birthday cake stopped with her hand on a cabinet latch and listened to the new silence that had swallowed the entire floor. Her name was Nora Voss. She was 31 years old. She had worked at Harlow Valley for 2 years, and in that time, not one person in that building had looked at her like she mattered. They were about to learn they had made a catastrophic mistake. If this story already has you holding your breath, stay with me until the end, because it only gets more intense from here. Hit like, subscribe so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The morning had started the way most of Nora's mornings started at Harlow Valley, with someone else taking credit for something she did. She had caught it at 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes into her shift. A patient in Bay 4, a 62-year-old man named Gerald Pruitt, had been flagged overnight for mild chest tightness and elevated blood pressure. The night nurse had charted it as anxiety, probably stress-related, recommended rest and a follow-up in the morning. Standard stuff, safe stuff. Nora had looked at the chart, looked at the man, and felt the back of her neck go cold. His color was wrong, not dramatically wrong. You had to know what you were looking for, but there was a grayish quality around his lips and a subtle asymmetry in the way he was breathing that the anxiety diagnosis didn't explain. She had seen that color before, not in a hospital, in places where there were no hospitals, and the difference between catching it and missing it was whether someone came home. She had flagged it immediately, pulled Dr. Ramsey Crawford from the hallway, and walked him through her reasoning, the lip pallor, the breathing pattern, the fact that the man's left hand had been rubbing his forearm repeatedly for the past 10 minutes. Crawford had looked at her with the particular brand of condescension he reserved for nursing staff he considered beneath his diagnostic pay grade. "He's anxious," Crawford said. "Night team called it right." "His presentation has changed since the night chart," Nora said. "I think we should run a troponin and get cardiology on the phone before we—" "I'll make the clinical calls, Bennett." He had been calling her Bennett for 2 years, despite being told her name was Voss. She had stopped correcting him 8 months ago. "Get him prepped for discharge when the paperwork clears." She had stood in the hallway after he walked away, breathing slowly through her nose, doing the calculation she always did. How hard to push, what she would lose, whether it was worth it. She went back to Gerald Pruitt's bay, checked his pulse manually, and while she was doing that, quietly flagged the case to the attending cardiologist on call through the internal system. Not Crawford. Over Crawford. She documented every step with timestamps. 40 minutes later, Gerald Pruitt was in the cardiac suite with a 90% blockage in his left anterior descending artery. The cardiologist, Dr. Amara Osei, had come down personally to find out who caught it. By the time she did, charge nurse Sylvia Hartman had already told the department supervisor that she had been the one to raise the concern. Nora found out the way she always found out. Through Emily Ruiz, the nursing assistant who worked the same shift rotation and had watched the whole thing happen from the med cart 3 feet away. "She told Morrow you caught nothing, and she had to step in," Emily said quietly, not looking up from the supply count she was running. "I heard her say it." Nora didn't answer for a moment. She straightened a stack of gauze packets that didn't need straightening. "Thanks, Em," she said. "You're not going to do anything." "I'm going to do my job." Emily finally looked at her. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite frustration, something in between, worn smooth from repetition. "One day," Emily said, "that's going to be the wrong answer." Nora didn't say anything. She picked up the next chart and moved on. Sylvia Hartman had been charge nurse on the main ER floor for 11 years, which was long enough that most of the department had simply stopped questioning her version of events. She was efficient, she was organized, and she kept the floor running with the kind of ruthless scheduling precision that made administrators love her and nurses quietly dread her. She had decided she didn't like Nora Voss approximately 6 weeks after Nora arrived. Nora had never been able to identify the exact reason. She suspected it was a combination of factors. The fact that Nora asked questions at staff meetings instead of just nodding, the fact that Nora's patient outcomes had an annoying habit of being better than average, and possibly the fact that Nora had once gently corrected a medication dosage calculation that Sylvia had written on the whiteboard in front of 3 other nurses and an intern. Sylvia had smiled at the time. Then she had started building a file. Nora didn't know about the file until 4 months ago when she had filed a report about suspicious billing discrepancies she'd noticed in patient discharge documentation. Twice in 1 week, she had seen patients charged for procedures that had not been performed. Minor items, the kind of thing that could be written off as clerical error, except that the pattern was too consistent to be accidental. She had documented it, gone through the proper channels, and submitted the report to hospital compliance. 2 weeks later, Sylvia had called her into a private meeting and placed a formal written warning in front of her. The warning cited disruptive communication with supervising physicians and failure to follow established documentation protocols. Neither charge had anything to do with billing. Nora had read it twice to make sure she wasn't missing something. "This is retaliation," Nora said. Sylvia's expression didn't change. "This is a documented performance concern. You'll have the opportunity to respond in writing within 5 business days. I filed a compliance report, and the compliance office will handle it through their process. This is a separate matter." "It's not a separate matter, Nora." Sylvia folded her hands on the table. "You've been here 2 years. You're talented, I'll grant you that. But you have a pattern of overstepping your role, of treating clinical decisions like they're open debates, and of inserting yourself into administrative processes that don't involve you. This warning is an opportunity to course correct before something worse happens." Nora had walked out of that meeting with the written warning in her hand, sat in her car in the parking garage for 4 minutes, and then driven home. She had not cried. She had learned a long time ago that crying was what happened when you still had the energy for it. The compliance report went nowhere, or it appeared to go nowhere. She received a form response acknowledging receipt and promising a review, and then silence. She followed up twice. The second follow-up email was answered by an automated reply. She had started documenting everything herself after that. Every patient interaction, every conversation with Crawford or Sylvia, every discrepancy she noticed in the billing logs, all of it time-stamped and backed up to her personal secure drive. It was obsessive, maybe. It was also the only thing she could think to do. The morning of the Gunman, she was 3 weeks from a formal performance review that Sylvia had scheduled with department administration. Emily had warned her quietly that the review wasn't going to go well, that Sylvia had been talking to people, building a case, laying groundwork for something more serious than a written warning. Nora had nodded when Emily told her. She had gone home that night and cooked dinner and watched half an episode of something she couldn't remember now and gone to bed. And in the morning she had come back because what else do you do? That was the version of Nora Voss that Harlow Valley Medical Center knew. Quiet, competent, overlooked, possibly on her way out. A nurse who did her job without complaint and absorbed mistreatment the way a wall absorbs sound, silently and without visible damage. What they didn't know, what nobody at Harlow Valley had ever known, was that Nora Voss had spent 4 years attached to a special operations support element operating in 3 combat theaters. She had been a combat medic first, then a trained sniper, part of a small unit that specialized in direct action and personnel recovery in environments where conventional medical support couldn't reach. She had kept people alive under fire. She had made decisions in seconds that most people couldn't make in a week, with incomplete information and no margin for error. She had left all of that behind when she discharged. She had buried it so thoroughly that sometimes she almost believed she had buried it in herself. The stillness, the threat assessment, the automatic calculation of sight lines and egress routes, and human behavior under stress. Almost. The moment the gunshot rang out through the emergency department and the room froze. Something shifted in the back of her skull, and she was no longer almost anything. She did not come out of the supply corridor. She stayed exactly where she was and listened. 1 shooter, main entrance. The rifle report was sharp, not suppressed, which meant either they weren't trying to stay quiet or they didn't care. The screaming that followed was ragged and immediate, not structured, not directed, just the involuntary release of a room full of people who had never heard a gun fired at close range. She could hear orders being shouted in a voice trained to cut through panic. Nobody moves. Everybody down. Hands where I can see them. She counted the voices she could identify. The shouter. A second voice near the triage desk. Quieter, more controlled, which was worse. 2 confirmed, possibly more. She cracked the supply room door half an inch and looked. The main ER floor was large, 12 treatment bays arranged in a U-shape, with a central nursing station and a wide corridor that connected to the trauma suite, radiology, and the stairwells. From her position in the side corridor, she had a partial sightline to the main entrance and the central station. She counted 3 immediately. The one who had fired was posted at the entrance, rifle up, watching the room. A second was at the nursing station, forcing a terrified registration clerk to the floor. The third was moving through the treatment bays, pulling curtains open one by one, searching, looking for someone specific. She let the door close to a crack again and thought for 3 seconds. The wounded detective. She had seen him brought in 40 minutes ago, gunshot to the thigh, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. He was in Bay 7, down the far corridor in police custody. A protection detail, which meant he was either a witness or someone important enough to protect, which meant the men currently holding her co-workers at gunpoint had a specific objective. The officers with him were either down or contained. She hadn't heard additional shots, which could mean they'd been subdued before they could respond, or it could mean the gunman had more people than she'd counted. She needed more information. She needed a phone. She needed to not get shot in the next 30 seconds. She checked the supply room methodically, working by feel along the shelves. IV tubing, gauze, a pulse oximeter, a sealed suture kit. Her hands found a pair of trauma shears in a drawer and she pocketed them. Not a weapon, exactly. Not nothing either. She thought about calling out, surrendering with everyone else, waiting. She thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. In Bay 7, there was a man with a gunshot wound who was now the reason a tactical team had come to a hospital. If they got to him, he was dead. That was not a question. That was a logical endpoint. She moved to the far end of the supply corridor, where a secondary door connected to the radiology hallway. The radiology hallway was empty and dim, the overhead fluorescents on their night cycle. She moved through it fast, keeping close to the wall, listening at every junction before crossing. The hospital's architecture was familiar to her, not because she had memorized it deliberately, but because she had spent 2 years navigating it daily, and her brain had mapped it the way it mapped everything, automatically, in case she ever needed it. She got to the stairwell door and paused. Voices above her. The second-floor walkway that overlooked the main atrium. A 4th gunman, possibly more. She went down instead of up. The basement connected to the service corridor that ran behind the trauma suite and emerged near the physician lounge, which had a landline because Crawford had once complained loudly about cell reception down there, and facilities had never gotten around to installing a repeater. She found the lounge empty, the door left ajar. She was across the room and had the landline receiver in her hand in under 5 seconds, dialing the direct emergency dispatch number she had memorized. Not because she had planned for this, but because memorizing numbers was something her brain did when it encountered information. The dispatcher picked up on the first ring. "This is Nora Voss, RN, Harlow Valley Medical Center. I need federal law enforcement and tactical response. We have an active armed hostage situation in the emergency department. At minimum 4 gunmen, possibly more. They are armed with rifles and appear to be targeting a specific patient under police protection. Officers at the scene may be down." She gave the dispatcher the address, the layout, the patient's approximate location, and the number of civilian hostages she had observed. She did it in 45 seconds, and she was already thinking about the next problem before she finished speaking. "Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line. I can't. I have people to keep alive." She hung up. Getting back to the main floor was the harder problem. She couldn't go back the way she came. The radiology corridor would be the first place they'd clear if they started systematically searching. She needed to move toward Bay 7 without crossing open floor, which meant the service access panels behind the treatment bays, maintenance access tunnels designed for utilities and equipment, narrow, low-ceilinged, not intended for human transit, but navigable if you didn't mind the dark and the smell of HVAC drainage. She found the access panel in the basement utility room, worked the latch with the trauma shears, and climbed in. It was tight. She moved on her forearms and knees, counting access points as she passed them, keeping her breathing controlled. The tunnel ran parallel to the bay corridor, and she could hear voices through the thin partition. The gunmen, moving, occasionally shouting instructions to the hostages, keeping people down and terrified. She counted the bays by the sound signatures, the beeping of monitors, the particular hiss of Bay 7's ventilator, which had been in for service last week and was running slightly loud. She stopped. She pressed her ear to the partition and listened. Two voices. One she didn't recognize, controlled, professional, giving instructions. One she did. Officer Danny Reeves, young, maybe 28, who had come in twice before with minor injuries and who she had always thought was going to be good at his job if he survived long enough. He was talking in the specific way people talked when they were trying to stay calm and weren't quite managing it. He's not stable. I'm telling you, if you move him right now, he won't survive transport. You need to let someone— Shut up. The other voice. Flat. Not cruel, which was somehow worse, professional. Where's the other officer? I don't know. A pause. Wrong answer. Nora heard the sound of impact. Brief, controlled. And Officer Reeves made a short, pained noise and went quiet. She found the panel latch, counted to 3, and pushed it open. The gunman had his back to her. He was maybe 6 feet tall, tactical vest, balaclava, the rifle slung across his chest, and a sidearm in his hand. He was standing over Officer Reeves, who was on the floor with his hands zip-tied behind him and blood running from his nose. The patient in Bay 7, a man in his 50s, pallid, with a bandaged thigh and an IV line running, was watching from the gurney with the particular expression of a man who had already accepted that he was probably going to die. The gunman heard the panel open. He turned. She threw the trauma shears. It was not a movie throw. She was not trying to impale him. She was throwing them at his face to make him flinch, and he did. Pulled back, raised his arm reflexively, which moved the sidearm offline. And she was already inside his reach, one hand on the gun arm at the wrist, the other driving an elbow into his throat. He was bigger than her. He recovered faster than she expected. The next 4 seconds were ugly, and nothing like the practiced movements she had run hundreds of times in a different life. It was all pressure and leverage and the specific chaos of 2 people trying to hurt each other in a small space with a lot of sharp surfaces. She took a hit to the ribs that was going to leave something interesting on an X-ray. She landed 3 that counted. He went down. She took his sidearm, checked the chamber, and stepped over him. Officer Reeves was looking at her from the floor with an expression that had moved entirely past fear into something closer to bewilderment. You're the nurse," he said, "from the front desk." "Lay still," she said, "and be quiet." She checked the patient. His BP was dropping, not from the original wound, but from stress response and positioning. She adjusted the IV, reset the monitoring sensors that had been disconnected, and did a rapid assessment in under a minute while listening for movement in the corridor. "Can you walk?" she asked the patient. "I don't— maybe." "Who are you?" "Someone who just cleared your room. We need to move you to a secure location before his friends realize he's been down too long and come looking." She glanced at Reeves. "Can you get your hands free if I cut the zip tie?" "Yeah." She used the gunman's tactical knife to cut the restraint. Reeves stood up slowly, steadied himself against the bay wall, and reached for the unconscious gunman's radio with the automatic reflex of someone who understood the value of enemy communications. Smart, she thought. He's going to be fine. "There's a staff-only stairwell at the end of this corridor," she said. "Leads to the oncology floor. It's not on the main hospital maps. It's a maintenance access point. 3rd door on the left, code is 4471. Doesn't change because nobody ever thinks about it." "How do you know that?" "Because I've worked here for 2 years, and I pay attention." She checked the corridor through the bay curtain. "Clear, for now." "I'll be right behind you. Move him carefully. The wound is stable, but I need him upright, not horizontal." "Where are you going?" She was already moving toward the corridor. "I counted 4 out there," she said. "I've got 3 left to find." She found the second one faster than she expected. He was posted at the junction between the main ER floor and the trauma corridor, a smart position, covering 2 approach angles, rifle up, watching both directions. He wasn't moving. He was good at his job, or at least at the standing still part of it. She came from the ceiling. The maintenance crawl space ran above the trauma corridor, and the access hatch was directly above the junction. She had helped an electrician find it 8 months ago when the overhead lighting in the corridor went out, and the hatch had been loose ever since. She came through it fast and dropped the 6 feet to the floor behind him before he had processed the sound of the hatch opening. He went down hard. She caught the rifle before it hit the floor. She restrained him with his own zip ties, a small satisfaction she allowed herself, and moved the rifle to an alcove behind a crash cart, where it wasn't immediately visible, but she could find it in under 10 seconds if she needed it. She was breathing harder now. The rib was talking to her in the specific way ribs talked when something was either cracked or badly bruised, and she was making the decision, consciously, to ignore it until later. She keyed the stolen radio, listened. 2 remaining gunmen, the one at the entrance, the original shooter, watching the main room, and a 4th she hadn't visually confirmed yet. The radio traffic was clipped and professional, short check-ins on a predetermined schedule. They were now 3 minutes past a check-in, and she heard the leader, the entrance shooter, try to raise the one she'd taken down in the trauma corridor. Static. Then silence. And then, "Phoenix, what's your status?" "Phoenix." Nothing. A longer pause. "Falcon, sweep south wing. Somebody's moving." She pressed herself against the wall and thought about the layout of the hospital one more time. The south wing, the physician lounge, the family waiting area, the administrative offices, all civilian spaces, all currently empty except for the staff who had been in those areas when the lockdown began. Emily Ruiz had been doing inventory on the south wing supply cart when the shooting started. Nora moved. She found Emily in the family waiting room, behind an overturned couch, phone clutched in both hands, recording something. Classic Emily. Terrified out of her mind and still collecting evidence. Nora put a hand over Emily's mouth before she could make a sound. Emily's eyes went wide, then wider, then cycled rapidly through several stages of emotion before settling on a kind of shaky relief. Nora took her hand away. "Don't talk," she mouthed. Emily nodded. She held up the phone, pointed at it, mimed typing. She'd been texting, someone outside, getting information out. The phone showed a string of outgoing messages to a number Nora didn't recognize, with location details and the layout of the south wing. Nora gave her a look that asked the question. "My cousin," Emily mouthed. "He's a cop." "Of course." Nora took the phone, typed fast. Federal response requested, 4 confirmed gunmen, 2 neutralized, 2 remaining, 1 at main entrance, 1 mobile in south wing, civilian hostages on main floor, witness patient relocated. "We need the main entrance shooter isolated before tactical entry." She gave the phone back. Emily read it, nodded, sent it. 30 seconds later, a message came back. "Units 10 minutes out, negotiator being set up. Hold position." 10 minutes was a long time. The radio on Nora's belt hissed. The leader's voice came through, no longer controlled. There was an edge in it now, something she recognized as the specific anger of a plan that was not going the way it was supposed to. "Falcon, report. I need Falcon's position. Somebody tell me what's happening down there." And then a different voice. Not one of the gunmen. Male, older, authoritative. Someone on a different channel who had accessed the hospital's intercom system. "Attention, Harlow Valley Medical Center. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have the building surrounded. This situation ends in the next 10 minutes, one way or another. Anyone with a weapon inside that building needs to make a decision right now." The room seemed to hold its breath. The leader's voice came back on the radio, and the control was gone from it now, replaced by something harder and colder and considerably more dangerous. "Find the nurse," he said. "Somebody found our people. It's a woman. She's still in the building. Find her." Emily looked at Nora. Nora looked at the door. 8 minutes. Nora did the math the way she always did math in situations like this. Not with hope, but with numbers. 8 minutes was 480 seconds. The leader knew someone had taken down 2 of his people. He knew it was a woman. He knew she was still inside. He had 1 confirmed shooter remaining in the south wing and himself at the main entrance. And he was now operating on damaged intelligence with a timetable that was almost certainly accelerating. The question wasn't whether he'd come for her. The question was whether he'd use the hostages to do it. She looked at Emily, who was pressed against the back of the overturned couch, with the phone clutched against her chest and her knees pulled up, and her eyes doing the thing eyes did when the brain behind them was working very hard to stay functional. Emily was 26 years old and had a 2-year-old at home, and had never, in 2 years of working alongside Nora, once complained about a shift change or a difficult patient or anything much. She was the kind of person who noticed things and kept quiet about them, which was probably why Nora trusted her more than most. "Stay here," Nora said, not a whisper. Just quiet, kept below the ambient sound of the building. "Absolutely not," Emily said. If you leave me here alone and something happens, I will never forgive you. Where are we going?" There was not time to argue. Nora looked at the room. One door leading back to the main corridor, one door connecting to the administrative wing, one window facing the east parking structure. The window was painted shut. The administrative wing door opened onto a long straight hallway with no cover. The main corridor was where Falcon would be sweeping. "The supply closet at the end of this hallway," Nora said. "Not because it's safe, because it's got a ceiling access panel, and I need to get above the main floor before the fourth gunman pins me somewhere I can't move from." Emily stood up. Her legs were shaking slightly, not enough to stop her, just enough to be visible. "Okay," she said. "Lead." They moved. The hallway was 40 feet and felt like 400. Nora went first, keeping Emily close behind her, checking the far end of the corridor before moving across each junction. The overhead lights in this wing were still on full, no emergency mode yet, which meant either the building systems hadn't triggered or someone had overridden them. The fluorescent brightness made her feel exposed in a way she didn't like. They reached the supply closet. Nora worked the door, unlocked, hinges on the inside, good, and pulled Emily through. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and old cardboard. Metal shelving along 3 walls, a mop sink in the corner, and directly above them, the ceiling access panel she had used twice before during supply inventory disputes when the HVAC system had been pulling contaminated air from the utility tunnel into the east wing. She had filed a maintenance report about it both times. Neither report had been actioned. She dragged a shelving unit 2 feet to the left, climbed it, pushed the panel up and back. The space above was dark and close and smelled like fiberglass insulation and decades of accumulated dust. "I can't go up there," Emily said. "You can." "I have a bad shoulder." "I know. I'll pull you." Nora was already up, crouched in the crawl space, reaching down with both hands. "Give me your good arm. Don't push with the bad one. Just let me take your weight." Emily looked at the gap. She looked at the corridor door. She reached up. It wasn't graceful. Nora's cracked rib sent a bolt of sensation through her left side that briefly narrowed her vision, and Emily banged her knee on the edge of the panel hard enough to make a sound that was probably audible from the corridor. But they got up. Nora replaced the panel from above. Dark. Almost completely dark, except for thin lines of light bleeding through the panel seams below them and a distant gray glow from somewhere ahead in the tunnel. Nora oriented herself by memory. The crawlspace ran east-west above the south wing and connected at the central junction to the larger utility tunnel that ran above the main ER floor. If she went forward maybe 60 feet, she'd be directly above the nursing station. She started moving. Emily followed without being told. The nursing station below was still occupied. She could hear it through the ceiling panels. Low voices, controlled, the shuffle of people forced to the floor, the occasional sharp command from the leader. He had moved from the main entrance to the nursing station, which meant either someone had covered the entrance or he'd given it up in favor of the central position. Tactically, the central position gave him sightlines to more of the floor. It was the right call, which told her something about him. She stopped above the station and listened for 60 seconds. She needed to understand what she was working with before she moved. Listening had saved her life more reliably than anything else she had ever done in the field, and she was not going to stop doing it because the ceiling was uncomfortable and her side hurt. She counted 12 civilian hostages on the floor. She could identify them by voice, by breathing, by the specific quality of silence that mass fear produced. She heard 2 distinct uniform voices she recognized from the ER, Dr. Crawford and Sylvia Hartman, which she noted without particular feeling. She heard the leader moving back and forth, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried, doing the thing people in control of situations did to remind everyone they were in control. And she heard something she hadn't expected, a phone call. The leader had his cell pressed to his ear, and he wasn't trying to be quiet about it. "Not there. The patient's not in Bay 7, the officer is gone, and I have 2 people down. No, I don't know how—" A pause. "I understand the timeline. I understand that. What I'm telling you is we have a complication." Another pause, longer. Yes, I'll handle it. He hung up. He had someone on the outside, someone who wasn't tactical, someone operational, someone directing this. The attack on a hospital, on a specific patient, wasn't freelance. Someone had planned it, had intelligence about the patient's location, and was now getting updated on why the plan was failing. She filed that information in the part of her brain that sorted things into categories. Important now. Important later. Important but not actionable. The phone call went in the last category. She couldn't use it in the next 10 minutes. She could use it after 6 minutes. She needed to deal with Falcon before the FBI entry team came through the doors, because tactical entries went wrong when there were unknown armed contacts inside the building that the entry team didn't know about. She had seen it happen. She was not going to let it happen here. She started moving again, back along the crawl space toward the South Wing Junction, where she'd last estimated Falcon's position. She heard him before she saw him. He was moving through the administrative wing. She could track him by the rhythm of his footsteps below her, methodical, room by room, the way someone moved when they were searching with purpose and were trained well enough not to rush. He hadn't found anything yet, which meant he was getting more cautious, not less. Careful searchers were harder to predict than sloppy ones. She tracked him for 3 rooms, getting ahead of him, positioning herself above the room she calculated he'd enter next, the records storage office, which was the last room in the administrative wing before the corridor dead-ended. She waited. His footsteps stopped outside the door. She heard the door open. He came in below her, swept the room visually the way he'd been trained to sweep rooms, checked the corners, checked under the desk, checked the closet. He did not check the ceiling, because almost nobody ever checked the ceiling, because the ceiling was out of reach and out of mind, because human threat assessment defaulted to horizontal. Nora dropped through the panel. The fall was 6 feet, and she took it in a controlled roll that brought her up behind him before he'd finished processing the sound of the panel moving. She had the sidearm up. She had trained herself a long time ago not to think about the decision. The decision was made before the situation arose, cleanly and without emotion, and then executed or not executed based on what the situation required. "Don't," she said. He froze. "Rifle down. Hands where I can see them. Do it slowly." He complied. He was good enough to do it without telegraphing anything. The rifle came down smoothly, hands out, body language cooperative, which meant he was waiting for his opening. "Kick it away." The rifle scraped across the tile floor. "Turn around." He turned. He was younger than she expected. Maybe 30, maybe less. Dark eyes above the balaclava, watching her with the flat professional assessment of someone who was calculating odds and not yet sure which direction they fell. "You're not a cop," he said. "No." "Military?" "I'm a nurse." Something shifted in his eyes. Not disbelief, more like recalibration, a rapid adjustment of the category he had placed her in. "You took down Reardon and Marsh." "They'll be okay. Reardon's got some throat bruising." A pause. "You could have used the gun." "I know." She saw him think about that. She saw him think about what kind of person went to the trouble of not using a gun when they could have in a situation like this. She watched him work through the implications. "There's more going on here than a witness," he said. "Isn't there?" "I'd stop talking and start thinking about your options," Nora said. "Federal agents are coming through those doors in about 4 minutes. How that goes for you depends on what you do in the next 30 seconds. He looked at her. He looked at the door. He looked at the rifle on the floor, which he had clearly already calculated was accessible to him faster than she could stop him. He was right about that. Probably she was hurt and working on will more than physical capacity at this point. And then he looked back at her and did the longer calculation, the one that accounted for whatever was on the other side of the math. "I want a lawyer," he said. "Lie down on the floor." He did. She used the tactical zip ties from his vest to restrain him, took his radio, and left him there. 3 minutes. Getting back above the main floor was the problem. She was one gunman from clear, but that last one was the leader. And the leader was in the center of the room surrounded by 12 civilians, and she had a sidearm and a cracked rib, and was starting to feel the accumulated cost of the last 90 minutes in her hands, which were not entirely steady. She went back to the crawl space. Above the nursing station, she lay flat and pressed her ear to the panel again and listened. Below her, the hostages were still down. The leader was still moving. She could hear Crawford. She recognized his voice, that particular clipped impatience that never quite left even when he was terrified, saying something to someone next to him, low, trying to be soothing, maybe? She had never heard Crawford try to be soothing before. Interesting what pressure did to people. And then she heard something else. A sound from outside the building. Not sirens, those had been audible for the last several minutes, positioned at a distance, standard tactical standoff. This was different. It was the specific percussion of boots on pavement moving in coordinated pattern, and then the crack of a door breach. Not the main entrance. The secondary entrance on the east side, which connected to the ambulance bay. They were coming in. She had maybe 90 seconds before the entry team was on the floor. And if the leader heard them before they reached him, he would have 12 people to use as bargaining chips or worse. She looked at the panel below her. She thought about the layout of the nursing station. The central desk, the monitors, the medication dispensary cart that was positioned on the left side of the desk, the computer terminals, the rolling chairs. She thought about angles. She thought about the leader's position as of 45 seconds ago, which was the right side of the desk, facing the main entrance, not facing the ceiling. She thought about the overhead intercom speaker directly above the nursing station, which was hardwired into the hospital communication system, and which, if you knew the manual override code that facilities had issued to nursing staff 2 years ago, and which Sylvia had immediately decided the floor nurses didn't need to know, and which Nora had memorized anyway, could be activated remotely from the ceiling access panel's junction box. She found the junction box in the dark by feel. She found the intercom bypass input, a small manual override module that facilities had installed for emergency announcements. She found the code sequence, and then she did something she had not done since her second deployment in a situation that she was not going to think about right now. She talked. "This is for the man with the rifle at the nursing station," she said, keeping her voice level and carrying it through the speaker directly above him. "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm above you, and the entry team is 45 seconds from your position, and you have a choice to make before this turns into something neither of us can undo." Below her, she heard the room go absolutely still. "You've lost your people. You didn't get the witness. Whoever told you this was going to work gave you bad intelligence. And right now, they're the ones sitting somewhere safe while you figure out how to walk out of a hospital without catching a federal charge for every person on that floor. So here's what I'm offering. Put the rifle down. Step away from the desk. Put your hands on your head. Do it in the next 20 seconds, and what happens next is between you and the lawyers. Don't do it." And it goes the other way. Silence. She counted. At 11 seconds, she heard the rifle hit the floor. At 15 seconds, she heard boots. The entry team coming through the ambulance bay door at a controlled run, which told her they'd been listening to the intercom, which told her someone had patched their comms into the hospital system. At 18 seconds, she heard the entry team leader shout, "Federal agents, hands where I can see them, everybody down." And then a second voice confirming, "Suspect compliant, hands up." And then the specific controlled chaos of a tactical entry resolving into something that was not a gunfight. She let herself lie flat on the crawlspace floor for a moment. Just a moment. Her side was genuinely hurting now, the kind of hurt that had moved past sharp and into deep, which either meant the rib was cracked and had shifted slightly, or it meant she was finally paying attention to it properly. Her hands were steadier than she expected. Her breathing was fine. She had a brief, involuntary thought about Gerald Pruitt, the man in Bay 4 that morning, the man whose heart had almost stopped because Crawford had glanced at a chart and decided he knew what he was looking at. She hoped Gerald was okay. She hadn't had time to check before everything else started, and that bothered her in the way small, specific things bothered her when large things were still unresolved. She found the nearest ceiling panel and lowered herself back to the floor. The FBI agent who met her in the South Wing corridor was a woman named Harker. Late 40s, compact, dark hair cut short, wearing tactical gear with a federal badge clipped to the vest. She was moving with the deliberate speed of someone who was used to arriving at places where things had already happened and needed to understand them fast. She stopped when she saw Nora. Nora was still holding the sidearm she'd taken off the first gunman. She held it out grip first, which was the sensible thing to do when a federal agent encountered you in a hallway following a hostage situation. Harker took it. She looked at Nora. The scrubs, the ID badge, the dried blood on her forearm that wasn't hers. The way she was standing, slightly favoring her left side. "You're the nurse," Harker said. "Nora Voss, I called it in." "You called it in and then you—" Harker stopped, recalibrated. "We've got 4 suspects in custody, 2 of them with injuries consistent with hand-to-hand contact. We've got a witness patient relocated and stable. We've got an officer with minor injuries who keeps talking about a nurse." She paused. "That's you." "Officer Reeves is upstairs. The patient's in stable condition, but his blood pressure was dropping earlier. Someone should check the IV line. We have medics on scene." Harker looked at her for another moment. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Nora looked at the wall for a second, then back. "I was in the Army," she said. "A while ago." "What unit?" "The kind you don't list on your nursing application." She shifted her weight. "I need to get back to my patients." "You need medical attention." "I know. I'll get to it." She meant it. She would, as soon as the things that needed doing were done. That was just how the order of operations worked. Harker studied her for a moment longer than was strictly professional. There was something in her expression that Nora had seen before, in the faces of people who had seen enough of the world to recognize a certain kind of person. Not a type exactly, more like a pattern of decisions, a particular way of moving through circumstances that revealed something about the person's relationship with fear. "Stay available," Harker said. "I'm going to need a full statement." "I know." She went to find her patients. The ER floor was controlled chaos. In the specific way it became controlled chaos after acute trauma. The hostages were being assessed. The perimeter was still active with federal personnel. 2 EMT teams had come in through the ambulance bay to handle the officers and civilians who needed immediate care. Nora worked the floor for 20 minutes before anyone from the hospital administration thought to look for her. And in those 20 minutes, she checked on Gerald Pruitt, stable, post-procedure, irritated about the noise, assessed 3 of the hostages for stress response symptoms, helped stabilize a hostage who'd had a panic attack severe enough to trigger a cardiac event, and found Emily Ruiz sitting on the floor of the South Wing supply closet, still clutching her phone, not crying. "You okay?" Nora asked. Emily looked up. "I think I'm going to throw up." "Normal. Is it over?" "For now." Emily let out a slow breath. "For now," she repeated. "Great, very reassuring." "You did well." "I hid behind a couch." "You got intelligence out. You gave your cousin's unit a layout and a position count. That's not hiding. That's contributing." Nora crouched down to her level. "Seriously, Em, you did well." Emily looked at her for a long moment. "Nora." "What?" "What the hell?" She said it quietly, almost reverently. "What the actual hell?" Nora almost smiled. "I'm going to go find you something for nausea. Don't you dare be normal right now. You took down 4 armed guys with a pair of trauma shears and the ceiling. 3. The leader surrendered. That's somehow worse." Emily pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, steadying herself. "Are you hurt?" "Probably." "That's not an answer." "It's the most honest answer I have right now." Nora stood up. "I'll get the nausea thing. Stay here until someone from Federal clears the wing." She left Emily in the supply closet and moved back toward the main floor. And that was when she saw Sylvia Hartman. Sylvia was standing near the ambulance bay entrance, talking to a man in a suit. Not Federal, not law enforcement. The suit was wrong for both. Administrative. Hospital administration. Nora recognized him from the one all-hands meeting she'd attended where the hospital's senior leadership had sat at a long table and discussed quarterly metrics in the tones of people who had never actually worked a patient floor. His name was Garrett Malone. He was the chief operations officer of Harlow Valley Medical Center and had been, according to the internal staff grapevine, increasingly involved in the billing and administrative oversight of the ER department over the past 18 months. Sylvia was talking to him quickly, leaning in, her posture the specific posture of someone having a conversation they needed to have before something else happened. Malone was nodding, his expression neutral and practiced, the expression of a man who is very used to receiving bad news and deciding how to manage it rather than respond to it. Nora stopped. She watched them for a moment. Sylvia's hands were moving. Malone touched his phone, looked at something on the screen, typed briefly. Sylvia nodded at whatever he showed her. They separated. Nora thought about the compliance report she had filed 4 months ago. She thought about the billing discrepancies she had documented. She thought about the man on the phone call she'd heard from above the nursing station. Someone operational, someone directing the attack from outside. Someone who had known the patient was at Harlow Valley specifically, which was not public information, which meant someone with access to internal hospital records had provided it. She thought about Malone, who had access to everything. She went to find Agent Harker. Harker was at the ambulance bay entrance, coordinating with the local law enforcement liaison. She listened to Nora without interrupting, which was more than most people did, and when Nora finished describing what she had heard, the phone call, the operational coordinator, the specific reference to a timeline, Harker's expression had settled into something that was not quite surprise. "You're suggesting the attack was internally facilitated," Harker said. "I'm suggesting someone gave the leader specific information about the patient's location that wasn't publicly available. And I'm suggesting you look at who in this building had access to that information and what else they might have access to." Nora hesitated. "I filed a compliance report 4 months ago about billing irregularities. It went nowhere. I've been wondering for a while if it went nowhere because someone made it go nowhere." Harker looked at her steadily. "Do you have documentation?" "Personal copies, time-stamped, on a secure drive that's not connected to any hospital system." Harker was quiet for a moment. "Voss?" "What?" "Go get your rib looked at. I'm serious. You're listing to the left." "I'm not." Nora stopped. She wasn't, quite, but close. "After." "No," Harker said, and there was something in it that was not unkind. "Right now. Because in about an hour, I'm going to need you sharp and documented and legally credible, and none of that works if you're running on fumes and a cracked bone." She flagged one of the medics moving through the bay. "I've been doing this job for 19 years. The people who stay useful are the ones who know when to stop moving." Nora stood there for a moment. She thought about the morning, the chart, Crawford, the dismissal, the stolen credit, the warning on her file, the performance review she was 3 weeks from. She thought about the way the day had started and the place it had ended, and the distance between those 2 points felt disorienting in a way she wasn't quite ready to examine. The medic arrived. Nora let herself be guided toward the assessment area. She was sitting on a gurney with her scrub top half up while the medic ran a careful hand along her rib cage when Crawford appeared. He came through the ambulance bay looking like a man who had recently been very frightened and was now in the process of reconstructing himself into someone who hadn't been. He was straightening his coat. He was doing the thing he did with his expression when he wanted it to say competent authority rather than what it was actually saying. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her, then at the medic doing the assessment, then back at her. "Voss?" he said. The name for once was correct. She waited. The officer upstairs is asking for you," Crawford said. "Reeves. He said to find you specifically." "I'll go up when this is done." Crawford nodded. He stood there for a moment longer than made sense, and she realized with mild surprise that he didn't know what to do with his face. The architectural certainty that usually occupied it was missing. He looked, and she didn't enjoy this observation particularly, it was just accurate. He looked like someone who had just discovered that a piece of furniture he had been walking past for years was actually a person. "The patient in Bay 4, he said. "Pruitt. He's stable. Dr. Osei handled it." "I know." A pause. "You caught it." "Yes." "I should have—" He stopped. Started again. "You were right, this morning. You were right, and I didn't listen." Nora looked at him. She thought about all the mornings, all the hallways, all the charts she'd flagged and the concerns she'd raised and the specific exhaustion of being consistently correct and consistently dismissed. She thought about what she wanted to say and what was actually worth saying. "I know," she said. He nodded. He left. The medic gave her a look, somewhere between impressed and sympathetic. "2 cracked ribs," the medic said. "You've been walking around with 2 cracked ribs." "How bad?" "Not displaced. You got lucky." He reached for the tape. You're going to be in genuine pain tomorrow. Tomorrow's tomorrow. Medical professionals always make the worst patients, he said, not unkindly. I know that too. She let him tape the ribs and thought about the phone call above the nursing station. She thought about Garrett Malone and Sylvia Hartman in the ambulance bay and the document she had on a personal drive at home and the compliance report that had gone into silence and stayed there. She thought about the leader of the gunmen, who was currently in federal custody and who had, at some point, received specific intelligence about a witness patient's location from someone inside the hospital. She thought about the billing discrepancies she had documented. She thought about the patterns she had noticed. Patients charged for procedures not performed, equipment billed at inflated rates, documentation irregularities that ran consistently through the same set of administrative records. She thought about all of this and felt something clarify in the back of her mind. The same thing that happened when a patient's presentation stopped being a collection of separate symptoms and became a single coherent diagnosis. The feeling of pieces that had been adjacent for months suddenly occupying the same space. She was getting up from the gurney when Harker came back. Harker's expression had changed. The careful neutrality was still there, but something had moved underneath it. Controlled urgency. The expression of someone who had just received information that shifted the scale of what she was dealing with. Voss, Harker said, I need you to come with me. What happened? The leader. He's talking. Harker paused. He says he got the patient's location from a contact inside this hospital, and he says the contact didn't just give him a room number. Nora waited. He says the contact gave him your name, Harker said. Specifically, someone inside this hospital told them a nurse named Nora Voss had filed a compliance report and was close to finding something, and that she needed to be removed from the picture before the FBI arrived. The bay was loud. People moving, radios crackling, the standard noise of aftermath. Nora stood very still inside it. They weren't just here for the witness, she said. No. Harker's voice was even. We think the witness and the compliance report connect to the same network. We think someone inside this hospital has been feeding patient information to external parties for at least 2 years, and we think the attack today was partly designed to destroy evidence and eliminate anyone who might have already found it. Nora thought about the 4 months of silence after her compliance report. She thought about the performance review scheduled in 3 weeks, which she now suspected would have ended in termination rather than discipline. She thought about how cleanly everything would have been resolved if the gunmen had found the witness and she had simply been a casualty of a hospital siege. They thought it would look like a robbery, she said, or a witness murder that went sideways and took some staff with it. Either way, the compliance report disappears, the documenting nurse disappears, and whoever's running the billing fraud has 6 months to clean the records before anyone starts asking new questions. Harker looked at her steadily. How long have you had this documentation? 4 months since the compliance report. 2 years of informal records. And it's off-site, personal secure drive, not connected to any hospital network. Something moved through Harker's expression, not quite relief, more like the specific satisfaction of a well-timed piece of luck. Good, she said. Because tomorrow morning I'm going to want everything you have, every timestamp, every irregularity, every name attached to a discrepancy. She paused. This is going to be a bigger case than a hostage situation. Nora felt the weight of that settle on her in a way she hadn't been ready for. She had filed the compliance report because it was the right thing to do, and it had been used to build a case against her career, and now it was apparently the thread connected to a federal investigation she hadn't known existed. The chain of logic was there, but the scale of it had a quality she was still processing. Harker, she said. What? The COO, Garrett Malone. He was talking to Sylvia Hartman in the ambulance bay about 20 minutes ago, before we spoke. Harker's expression didn't change, but her hand moved to her radio. What were they talking about? I couldn't hear the content, but the body language was specific. Define specific. The kind of conversation you have when something has gone wrong and you're deciding how to tell the story before someone else tells it for you. Harker clicked her radio, gave a quiet 2-sentence instruction, then looked back at Nora. Go upstairs, she said. Talk to Officer Reeves. Stay inside the federal perimeter and don't go anywhere without telling me first. What are you going to do? My job, Harker said. and something in the way she said it had the particular finality of someone who had just decided how the next 12 hours were going to unfold. Nora went to find the stairs. She was halfway up the stairwell when her phone, still in her scrub pocket, somehow still charged, buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She stopped, opened it. "We know you have the files. Return them and walk away. This is the only time you'll be asked." She looked at the message for a moment. She looked at the stairwell wall. She screenshotted the message, sent it to Harker, and kept climbing. The stairwell door opened onto the second floor with a pneumatic hiss, and Nora stepped into a hallway that looked exactly like what it was, a hospital floor that hadn't been touched by any of what happened below, still lit and quiet, the oncology ward running its evening routines in ignorance of the federal operation 2 floors down. Officer Danny Reeves was in a room at the end of the hall, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed with a blood pressure cuff on his arm and an expression of acute discomfort that had nothing to do with his injuries. He was the kind of young that still surprised people when it came with competence. Maybe 27, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that was already purpling from where he'd taken the hit in Bay 7. He had his badge in his hand, turning it over and turning it over, the way people handled familiar objects when they needed something to occupy the part of their brain that was trying to process things it hadn't been trained for. He looked up when Nora came in. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She pulled a chair up and sat down. Her taped ribs protested the movement with a specific grinding sensation that she noted and set aside. "How's the nose?" "Not broken, apparently." He touched it with 2 fingers. "Hurts like it is. It'll look worse tomorrow." "Great." He set the badge down on the bed beside him. "They told me you got all 4 of them." 3.5. The leader surrendered. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding how to say something. "Who are you?" It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. She could tell by the way he asked it. No performance in it, just a man trying to square what he'd seen with what he thought he knew about the world. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I was in the Army before that." "What did you do?" "In the Army." "Various things." He waited, and she recognized the tactic, the deliberate patient silence, and almost smiled. "I was a combat medic first," she said. "Then I cross-trained. The short version is that I spent 4 years doing things in places that don't get named in official statements, and then I got out and went to nursing school because it was the closest thing I could find that felt like the part of the work that mattered." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "The patient," he said to him, "the man in Bay 7. He's stable. Federal custody, secured location. I don't know more than that." "He's a federal witness," Reeves said. "I wasn't supposed to know the details, but you can't stand in a room with someone for 4 hours and not pick up context. He's been in the system for 8 months. Whatever he knows, it's big enough that someone sent a tactical team to a civilian hospital to get to him." "I know." "Do you know what he witnessed?" "Not specifically." Reeves picked up the badge again. "The man on the phone," he said, "the one who called the leader while they had us." Nora went still. "You heard that." "I was on the floor with my hands zip-tied, not unconscious. I heard most of it." He looked at his badge. The leader said a name, just once, at the end, before he hung up. "I caught it because it was a hospital name, and an administrator." The room felt suddenly smaller. "What name?" Nora said. Reeves looked up at her. His jaw was tight. "Malone," he said. She was back down the stairwell in 90 seconds, moving faster than her ribs were happy about, her phone already dialing Harker. The call connected on the second ring. "Reeves has corroboration," Nora said. "He heard the phone call. The leader used a name, Malone." A pause on the other end that lasted exactly long enough to tell her Harker was processing something she hadn't expected, or confirming something she'd already suspected. "Where's Reeves now?" "Second floor oncology, end of the hall, room 214. He's ambulatory." "I'm sending someone up." Harker's voice had the specific compression of someone who was already moving while talking. "Voss, I need you to stay on the second floor. Do not come back to the main ER level." "What's happening?" "We're executing a detention on Malone in about 4 minutes, and I need the corridors clear." "Hartman, we're watching her. Stay put." Harker ended the call. Nora stood in the stairwell and listened to the building around her. The ambient sounds of a hospital at three-quarters capacity, the residual noise of the federal operation on the ground floor, the particular quality of quiet that preceded something happening. She had stood in places like this before, in thinner walls than these, in darker corridors with less information and higher stakes. The sensation wasn't comfort, exactly. It was more like recognition. She went back upstairs. The oncology floor charge nurse was a small, deliberate woman named Rosario, who had worked nights for 18 years and approached every novel situation with the same expression of tired, calibrated skepticism. She looked at Nora, says the scrubs, the taped ribs visible where the collar of the top had shifted, the dried blood that the medic had not fully cleaned from her forearm, and said, "Are you supposed to be up here?" "Federal instruction," Nora said. "I'm waiting for clearance." Rosario looked at her for another moment. "You want coffee?" "Yes." "Come on then." They sat at the nurse's station, and Rosario poured coffee from a machine that was several generations behind the ones on the main ER floor, and said nothing while Nora drank it, which was the best thing Rosario could have done. There was a particular kindness in not asking questions, Nora had found. Most people didn't know how to do it. Her phone buzzed. Harker. "Malone is not in the building. Security shows him leaving through the east exit 14 minutes ago. We have units on the road, but he had a head start." Then 30 seconds later, "Hartman is in custody. She's talking." Nora stared at the screen. Malone had left before Harker moved on him, which meant either he'd had someone watching the federal activity and timed his exit, or he'd panicked and run, which was actually less likely. Panic was for people who hadn't planned for this eventuality. He had planned for it. She typed back, "Does Hartman know where he went?" The response took almost 2 minutes. "Working on it. Stay available." Rosario refilled her coffee without being asked. "Bad news?" Rosario said. "Complicated news," Nora said. Rosario sat back. "I've been a nurse long enough to know those are usually the same thing." The next hour had this particular quality of aftermath. Not quiet exactly, but the absence of forward motion, which after sustained crisis felt uncomfortably like silence. Nora stayed on the second floor, answered 2 calls from Harker, gave a recorded statement to a federal investigator named Travers, who arrived with a laptop in the manner of someone who typed very fast and asked questions with surgical efficiency, and then sat in a hallway chair and felt the accumulated weight of the day begin its descent into her body. The ribs. The shoulder she'd tweaked coming down from the ceiling access panel and had not mentioned to the medic. The specific exhaustion that came not from physical exertion alone, but from the sustained activation of everything she had spent 2 years trying to keep dormant. She had been, for 2 years, an unremarkable nurse on a hospital floor that barely registered her presence. She had been invisible by choice, mostly. Not entirely, but mostly. The invisibility was easier. The invisibility meant she could do the work without the complication of being seen doing it, without the attention, without the weight of people's expectations, or their fear, or their need to fit her into a category that made sense to them. She knew, with the cold, pragmatic clarity she applied to most things, that the invisibility was over. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Harker. The number was unfamiliar, different from the earlier threat, not the same sequence. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Voss," she said. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a man's voice, careful and unhurried in the way of someone who had decided they had nothing left to lose from a conversation. "My name is Warren Saul," the voice said. "I'm the federal witness your people kept alive tonight." Nora sat forward. "I asked them to let me call you," he said. "They weren't thrilled about it, but I told them what I'm about to tell you, and they agreed you needed to know." "Go ahead." "The network that sent those men tonight, Malone is part of it, but he's not the top. He's a node. He manages the hospital end, the billing fraud, the data access, the patient information they sell to pharmaceutical companies, and insurance flagging operations. That's one revenue stream. The witness protection breach is a different channel, connected to the same network, but operated separately." Nora was quiet, processing. "How do you know this?" she said. "Because I built part of it." His voice was level. "I was an administrative consultant for a company called Veritan Health Partners. I thought I was doing compliance audits. 3 years in, I found out the audits were cover. The real operation was using the access to mine patient records, manipulate billing across 6 hospitals, and sell anonymized data packages to parties that were definitely not pharmaceutical researchers. A pause. When I understood what I was inside, I went to the FBI 8 months ago. And someone inside the FBI, someone inside someone's office, Saul said. My handler doesn't know. But somewhere in the chain, information about my location moved. It moved to Malone, and Malone moved it to the team tonight. Nora thought about this in the way she thought about complex patient presentations. Not linearly, but in parallel, testing each piece against the others for fit and tension. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you have documentation that I don't have, Saul said. I know about the billing irregularities at Harlow Valley from the inside, the system, the methodology. You have specific records, time-stamped, with names attached. The FBI has my testimony, but testimony alone isn't enough if the paper trail is clean. The paper trail isn't clean, Nora said. I know. Something in his voice shifted, a small, exhausted quality that hadn't been there before. The nurse who kept filing reports, that's you. That's me. They were trying to get rid of you before you figured out what you had. He paused. You figured it out anyway. I'm still figuring it out. Agent Harker's good, he said. She'll do this right. I just wanted you to know the full shape of what you're in. The call ended. Nora sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the oncology floor hallway. The linoleum, the overhead lights, the cart of medications being wheeled by a night shift nurse who glanced at her with mild professional curiosity and moved on. She sat in it for exactly the time it took to reorganize what she knew into what it actually was. Then she called Harker. Harker listened to the summary of the call without interrupting. When Nora finished, there was a pause. Voss, Harker said, I need your documentation tonight. Not tomorrow morning, tonight. It's on a drive at my apartment. Can someone you trust get it? Nora thought. The list of people she trusted with a task like this was short, not from paranoia, just from accurate self-assessment of the relevant relationships. Emily Ruiz, she said. She has a key. I can walk her through where it is. Make the call. I'll have an agent with her when she goes. Harker? What? Malone. We'll find him. He had a 14-minute head start before your units were on the road. He left on foot or by a vehicle that wasn't his registered car, or your cameras would have flagged it faster. He planned this exit. She paused. He's not running. Running is what people do when they don't have a next move. He has a next move. Another pause. Longer this time. What's the next move? Harker said. It wasn't a question she expected Nora to answer. It was the kind of thing you said out loud to organize your own thinking, and Harker was the sort of person who did that. The evidence that connects him to the network, Nora said. If my documentation is as specific as I think it is, and if Saul's testimony is what he says it is, the case survives without Malone. But Malone doesn't know what I have. He knows I have something. That's why they flagged me. He doesn't know how much. So his next move is to assess what you have before he decides whether to run or negotiate. Or to remove it, Nora said, before it gets to you. Harker's voice went very quiet. Where does Emily Ruiz live? Northeast side, Pembroke District. But the drive isn't at her place, it's at mine. Heron Street, Eastgate. I'm sending units to both locations now. He's in the background, rapid movement. Call Ruiz. Tell her to stay where she is and open the door when federal agents arrive. Do it now. Emily answered on this first ring. Hey, I was just about to call you, Emily said. Are you okay? I got released by a federal guy who looked like he hadn't slept in a year, and then I just drove home and I'm sitting here not knowing what to do with my hands. Listen. Nora kept her voice even. I need you to do exactly what I'm about to tell you. Federal agents are coming to your door in the next few minutes. Open the door. Do not go anywhere until they arrive. A beat of silence. That sounds bad, Emily said. It's precautionary. That also sounds bad. There's something I need to explain later about what I found in the billing records and what it connects to. And when I do, you're going to understand why precautionary is the word I'm using. But right now, I need you to stay put. Okay. Emily's voice was steadier than Nora expected. Okay. I'm here. Nora. What? Whatever this is, you're not in it alone. Nora didn't answer immediately. She thought about 2 years of working alongside Emily. The quiet solidarity of a person who noticed things and kept them to themselves and still managed to show up every shift like it meant something. I know, she said. Stay put. She ended the call and was already moving toward the stairwell when the lights went out. Not all the lights. Not the building. The backup generators kicked in within 4 seconds, the way hospital backup systems were required to do by code. So the floor went to emergency lighting, the specific amber half-darkness of reduced power mode, enough to see by, not enough for detail. The change ran through the entire building simultaneously, which meant it hadn't been a local fault. Someone had killed the main power. Nora was through the stairwell door before the generators finished cycling. She went down one flight and pushed into the first-floor corridor, where the emergency lighting made the hallway look like a different building, all shadow angles and flat amber, the familiar geography rendered strange. She heard voices immediately, federal agents coordinating, someone with a flashlight. The particular compressed urgency of people who had been managing a contained situation that had just become less contained. She found Harker near the ambulance bay, and Harker's expression told her what she needed to know before a word was spoken. Generator was sabotaged, Harker said. External junction, east side of the building. We have someone who knew the layout. Malone knew the layout. Yes. Harker's jaw was tight. We've also lost contact with the unit I sent to your apartment. The sentence landed in Nora's chest like something physical. Lost contact, she said. 3 minutes ago. 2 agents. Last check-in was approaching your building. Routine. Nora looked at the dark corridor. She looked at the amber light and the moving shadows and the building that she had worked in for 2 years and knew in the precise way you knew a place you navigated daily. He's here, she said. He might be at your apartment. He's here. She said it with the certainty of tactical logic, not instinct. Instinct was the word people used when they didn't want to explain the reasoning. The power cut is a distraction. It buys time and creates confusion, but it also reveals that whoever did it is close enough to monitor the result. The apartment is a secondary concern. Getting the drive from my apartment doesn't help him if I can testify to everything on it from memory. I'm the primary concern. Harker looked at her for exactly the time it took to decide she was right. Where would he go? Harker said. If he's in the building. Nora thought about Malone. She had met him twice, spoken to him once. COO. 11 years at Harlow Valley, which meant he knew this building the way administrators knew buildings. From the organizational chart, from the reports, from the floor plans in the emergency protocols. Not the way she knew it. Not the crawl spaces and the loose access panels and the supply corridors that didn't show on the main schematics because they'd been added during a renovation 12 years ago and the paperwork had been filed incorrectly. He would go where the records were. The administrative server room, she said. Sublevel 1. It's where patient records, billing data, and internal communications are physically stored. If he can wipe or corrupt the server before your people get there, the paper trail collapses. We have agents on the server room. How many? 2. How are they doing in the dark? Harker was already moving, already on the radio, and Nora was moving with her without being asked, and Harker didn't tell her to stop, which Nora took as operational consent. The sublevel was accessible from 2 points, the main elevator bank, which was down in power cut mode, and the service stairwell near the loading dock, which ran on the backup system. They took the service stairwell, Harker with 2 agents flanking her and Nora 1 step behind, moving in the amber emergency light with a flashlight Harker had produced from somewhere. The sublevel corridor was narrow and low-ceilinged, built for infrastructure, not people, with exposed pipes along the ceiling and the persistent smell of electrical systems and cool concrete. The server room was at the far end, and as they turned into the corridor, Nora could see the door was open. Harker held up a fist. Everybody stopped. From the server room, sound, movement, the specific sound of a keyboard, frantic. Harker signaled. The agents moved up. The server room was maybe 400 square feet, floor-to-ceiling racks of servers and storage units, with a terminal in the center that was running on the backup power. A man was at the terminal, his back to the door, both hands working the keyboard with the desperate focused speed of someone who had a limited time and knew it. Garrett Malone was heavier in person than he looked in the all-hands meeting photographs. Early 50s, gray at the temples, in a suit that had traveled badly. He heard them come in and turned, and his face did something complicated. Not surprise, more like the specific expression of a man whose calculation had come out wrong and was already running the next one. He had a phone in his left hand. His right hand moved to the terminal and hit a single key. "Stop," Harker said, and there was a quality in it that had nothing to do with volume. Malone stopped. He looked at Harker. He looked at the agents. He looked at Nora, standing in the doorway, and his expression shifted in a way that told her she had been correctly assessed as the reason the plan had failed. "Whatever he just ran," Nora said to Harker, "it's a wipe sequence. Remote initiation. He's probably got a secondary agent on the phone confirming the command." Harker's agent was already at the terminal, pulling the keyboard back, reading the screen. "Deletion protocol initiated," the agent said. "Estimated completion." "Abort it," Harker said. "I'm trying." "Server room has a physical interrupt," Nora said, moving into the room past Malone without quite looking at him. She had been in the sub-level once before, 8 months ago, during a mandatory emergency preparedness drill that most of the nursing staff had treated as an extended coffee break, and which Nora had treated as an opportunity to understand the hospital's physical infrastructure. She moved to the far wall, found the panel she was looking for, opened it. There's a manual interrupt installed as a safety measure for exactly this kind of event. It kills the wipe process at the hardware level. She found the switch, pulled it. The terminal screen went blank. The agent looked at the screen, then at Nora, then at Harker. "Process terminated," the agent said. The server room was very quiet for a moment. Malone said nothing. He was looking at Nora with an expression that she would have called resignation if there had been anything soft in it, but there wasn't. It was the expression of a man revising his understanding of how thoroughly he had underestimated something. "Garrett Malone," Harker said, "you are under arrest." She kept talking. Rights, charges, the formal language of federal detention, and Nora stopped listening to the words and started listening past them, the way she had learned to listen in environments where the most important information was often the thing nobody was saying out loud. She heard Malone's breathing, controlled, deliberate. She heard the agent on her left shift his weight. She heard the phone in Malone's left hand, the one he'd been holding when they came in, emit a single soft sound. Not a notification. Something smaller. A confirmation tone. She looked at his hand. The phone screen was dark, but the call icon showed a connected duration of 4 minutes and 18 seconds. "Harker," she said. She said it with exactly the amount of urgency required, which was more than was comfortable and less than was theatrical, and Harker heard it and turned. "His phone," Nora said. "Active call, 4 minutes. He's been transmitting everything." Harker reached Malone in 2 steps, had the phone in her hand, and the voice on the other end, she put it on speaker and the voice filled the small server room, was giving instructions in a rapid, quiet stream that stopped the moment the ambient sound changed. A pause. Then the voice on the phone said, "Contingency 4," and the fire suppression system activated. Hospital server rooms used clean agent suppression, not water, which would destroy the equipment, but a chemical suppressant dispersed as gas, designed to displace oxygen and kill fire without causing collateral damage, effective on electronics. Survivable by humans, technically, if exposure was brief and they could get out. The problem was the door. It had locked automatically when the suppression activated. Standard fire protocol, contained environment, keep the suppressant in and the oxygen-dependent fire out. The manual release was on the outside. The suppressant was already filling the lower third of the room. Not visible exactly, but Nora could feel it. The specific sensation at the back of the throat that preceded serious respiratory compromise. She had approximately 90 seconds before that compromise became a medical event. 3 federal agents, Harker, Malone, herself, 6 people. She moved to the door, found the interior release mechanism. There was one, there had to be, fire code required an interior release, and felt along the frame in the dimming emergency light, the suppressant at ankle level now, rising. The mechanism was supposed to be a red-handled lever at approximately chest height on the hinge side of the door. It was gone. The mount was there. The lever was not. Someone had removed it. Contingency 4 had included the server room's emergency release. This had been planned. She heard Harker coughing. Single, controlled, the start of it. The agents were moving toward the door. Malone had his collar pulled over his face. Nora looked at the door. She looked at the hinges. She looked at the rack of servers beside her, heavy, steel-framed, mounted on casters. "Get back from the door," she said. Loud, clear, no room for ambiguity. "Voss, back, now." They moved back. She unlocked the casters on the server rack nearest to the door, her fingers working fast, not quite steady, the suppressant at knee level now, and her eyes already starting to water. She got 3 of the 4 casters free, which was enough. She pushed. The rack weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds and moved with the reluctant momentum of something not designed to be moved quickly, but it moved, and she put everything she had into the last 2 feet, driving it at the door hinge side with the full mass behind it. The door frame held. The hinges did not. The door came off at an angle. Not clean, not all the way, but enough. Harker was through the gap in 2 seconds, pulling the door the rest of the way with brute force. And then the agents were through, and Malone was through, and Nora was the last one out because she had been the one pushing. And when she came through the gap, the corridor air hit her throat like something she hadn't known she was missing. She put her hand on the wall and coughed and waited for her eyes to clear. Harker's hand was on her arm, not pulling her, just there. "I'm okay," Nora said. "You pulled a server rack off the wall." The hinges were the weak point. Harker looked at her for a moment. In the corridor's amber emergency light, with the suppressant still venting through the open door and the sound of footsteps coming from the stairwell, as additional agents responded to the commotion, Harker's expression had the particular quality of someone reassessing a situation they thought they understood. "You need to stop doing things that require medical attention," Harker said. "I know," Nora said. One of the agents had Malone against the corridor wall, hands secured. Malone was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who had arrived at the end of the available options. Harker was already on the radio, coordinating the trace on the phone call, pulling units toward whatever contingency 4 meant on the outside of the building. The investigation was accelerating past the physical location of the hospital, spreading outward through the network that the evening had started to expose. Nora leaned against the corridor wall and breathed. Her side, her shoulder, her throat. She was running an involuntary triage on herself the way she always did, and the results were not alarming, but they were definitive. She was reaching the edge of what the body managed on adrenaline and stubbornness alone, and the edge was closer than it had been an hour ago. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen expecting Harker's number or the unknown threat line, or Emily. Instead, it was the hospital's internal extension system, a number she recognized as the oncology floor nurse's station. Rosario. She answered. "I don't know what I'm involved in," Rosario said without preamble, in the tone of someone who had decided ignorance was not an option. "But there is a man up here who says he's a federal agent and his ID looks right, but he's asking where you are, and I've been a nurse for 31 years and something about it is wrong." Nora straightened off the wall. "Describe him," she said. Rosario described him. Not one of Harker's agents, not any federal officer she had seen tonight. The physical description was specific and wrong in the specific way things were wrong when someone was wearing a role that didn't quite fit. The badge was right, the suit was right, but the questions were wrong. The way he was asking was wrong. The direction he was looking was wrong. "Where's Officer Reeves?" Nora said. A half-second pause that told her everything before the words did. "He was here 20 minutes ago," Rosario said. "He's not in the room now." Nora was moving before she finished the call. She took the service stairwell at a controlled run, not sprinting, because sprinting up 2 flights with 2 cracked ribs and a compromised shoulder was how you ended up on the floor, and pushed through the second-floor door into the oncology hallway with her phone already dialing Harker. The call connected in the stairwell echo, and she kept talking as she moved. "Second floor, someone impersonating federal. Reeves is missing." Harker's response was immediate and profane. Then, "Units on the way. Do not engage alone." Nora didn't answer that. She ended the call and moved down the hallway. The oncology floor was quiet in the way hospital floors were quiet at this hour. Not empty, just reduced, the night staff in their routines, monitors running, the ambient hum of a building doing the work it was built for. The room at the end of the hall where she'd left Reeves was open. Light on. Empty, the way Rosario had said. Bed unmade, blood pressure cuff still on the rail, his badge gone from where he'd set it on the mattress. Not a badge. That detail mattered. She stood in the doorway for 2 seconds and thought about it. If someone had taken Reeves by force, quickly and quietly enough not to alert the nursing staff, they had done it in a window of maybe 15 minutes, between when Rosario last saw him and when she called. 15 minutes was enough time to move a person from a second-floor hospital room to almost anywhere in the building. But a cop missing his badge was not a cop who'd been taken without warning. Reeves had seen something coming. He had taken the badge with him, which meant he was moving under his own volition, trying to preserve his identification for a reason. She went to Rosario at the nurse's station. Rosario looked at her with the expression of someone who had decided to be useful rather than alarmed, which was the correct decision and the harder one. "The man who was asking for me," Nora said. "Which direction did he go when he left?" "East corridor," Rosario said, "toward the rehabilitation wing." "Is there a stairwell access from rehab?" "End of the wing. Connects to the roof access above and the physical therapy suite below." "Security cameras in the corridor?" "One. At the junction." "Can you pull the feed from here?" Rosario turned to her workstation without another word, which was the thing Nora appreciated most about her, and brought up the security interface. The system was running on backup power. The image was slightly degraded, monochrome, but functional. She rewound 2 minutes. At 1 minute 40 seconds prior, a figure moved through the East Corridor junction. Tall, the suit Rosario had described, walking with the specific, deliberate pace of someone who wanted to look unhurried. Behind him, slightly to the left, another figure, shorter, moving under his own power, but the body language was wrong. The careful way he held his left arm telling a story about what was against his side. Reeves. Upright. Moving. But not freely. And then at the edge of the frame, before the corridor turned, Reeves looked directly at the camera. Just for a second. Then looked away. He knew it was there. He had looked at it on purpose. Nora watched it twice. "Rehab wing," she said. "Roof access." "I'll call it in," Rosario said. "Do that." Nora was already moving. "Tell them east stairwell, possible roof access, one armed suspect, one hostage, officer." She stopped. "And Rosario." The older woman looked at her. "Lock this floor down after I leave," Nora said. "Nobody in or out that you don't personally recognize." Rosario nodded. It was the nod of someone who had managed a hospital floor for 3 decades and understood exactly what locking something down meant. The rehabilitation wing connected to the main hospital body through a glass-walled corridor that looked out over the east parking structure, and at this hour and in this emergency lighting, it felt like moving through the inside of something dim and aquatic. Nora went fast and low, keeping to the right wall, checking the corridor in before she moved into it. Clear. She went. The stairwell door at the end of the rehab wing was slightly ajar. She checked the gap. Dark above. The stairwell climbing to the roof access level. She listened. Footsteps above. 2 sets. Distinct rhythms, uneven on the stairs. Someone being moved. Someone else moving them. She went in. She climbed as quietly as she could, which was not as quietly as she would have liked because her right knee had developed an opinion about stairs sometime in the last hour that it hadn't had previously. She got to the roof access landing and stopped below the final door. The door was propped open with a fire extinguisher. Through the gap, amber from the emergency light spilling into the darkness above. She listened. Not going to work. Reeves. Controlled, but the control was working hard. You understand that. There are federal agents on every exit. There are federal agents managing a building incident, the other voice said. Smooth. The kind of smooth that came from practice. That buys time. Time for what? Time for people to make decisions about what they know and what they're prepared to say. Nora placed the voice. Not Malone. She'd heard Malone speak twice, and this was different in register and cadence. This was someone younger, or someone who had grown up in a different part of the country. Someone who had been on the inside of something for a long time and had learned to talk about it the way people talked about weather, as if it were simply a condition of the environment. She pushed the door open and went through. Mom. The hospital roof was flat and wide, covered in HVAC units and antenna arrays, with a low parapet wall around the perimeter and a helicopter landing pad on the south end that hadn't been used in years. The trauma center had its own dedicated pad on the ground. The emergency lighting didn't reach up here. The only light came from the city below and the building's own residual glow, which was enough to see by if you'd given your eyes time to adjust, which Nora had, on the stairs. She saw Reeves first, sitting against an HVAC unit, 12 feet from the door, hands behind him, wrists secured to a pipe with what looked like heavy cable ties. He saw her, and his expression did something specific. Not relief, not alarm, but the careful, controlled acknowledgement of someone passing information through a look. Behind him, standing at a distance that placed the HVAC unit between himself and the door, was the man from the security camera. Up close, he was around 40, lean, the suit jacket now open, one hand visible and one not. He registered Nora in about half a second. The half second told her he was trained, not the way the tactical team downstairs had been trained, more like the way administrators in certain industries were trained, people who spent time in environments where threat assessment was useful and who had learned the basics without having ever needed to use them seriously. He was reassessing her. She could see it. The quick recalculation, the same recalculation she'd seen on the face of Falcon in the records storage office. The nurse. What is she? I'm not armed, she said. She kept her hands visible and away from her body. I'm a nurse. I want to talk. The visible hand moved. Not toward her. A small gesture, settling himself. Who are you? He said. Nora Voss. I work the ER. I filed the compliance report 4 months ago. She kept her voice flat and conversational, the way she kept her voice when she was talking to a patient in pain. Not soothing, because people in real pain heard through soothing, but level. You're not from the tactical team. You're not law enforcement. You're operational. You manage information, not people. That's why they sent you up here instead of someone who knows how to handle a hostage. A pause. Reeves is a precaution, he said. I understand that. She took one step. Not toward him. Toward the parapet, angling herself so the HVAC unit between them was no longer directly in her line of sight to Reeves. What's your name? That doesn't matter. It will. In about 10 minutes, when the agents from downstairs get to this roof, which they will because Officer Reeves looked directly at a security camera on his way here, and that was not an accident. Whatever leverage you think you have right now has a very short shelf life. His jaw tightened. Small movement, but she caught it. Malone was your supervisor, she said. It wasn't a guess. The way he'd said decisions about what they know had the cadence of someone talking about institutional liability, not criminal conspiracy. He was adjacent, not core. Your compliance or legal? You were managing the documentation side, making sure the billing irregularities looked like administrative variance and not systematic fraud. He looked at her. I'm a nurse, she said again. I read documentation the way other people read faces. I've been looking at your hospital's billing records for 18 months and I know what deliberate variance looks like. You don't know what you have. I know exactly what I have. She took another step. Not aggressive, gradual, the way you move toward an animal that was deciding whether to bolt. I have 3 years of systematic overbilling across 7 service categories. I have a pattern that runs through 4 administrative accounts. I have emails that were sent through a secure internal channel that the compliance office doesn't monitor because your predecessor convinced them it was a legacy system. And I have all of it backed up off-site in a location that nobody touched tonight. Gishiks Bipachas. She watched the information land. He had gone still. The specific stillness of a person whose plan has just been shown to them from the outside and found deficient. The drive, he said. Harker has it, Nora said, 2 hours ago. This was not true. Harker had units going to retrieve it, but she didn't know yet if they had it. But the statement was close enough to true that the distinction didn't matter, and she delivered it the way she delivered difficult diagnoses. Without hesitation, because hesitation was what patients heard, not content. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down. Not dramatically, just lowered himself to the roof surface with the movement of a man whose legs had decided something before his mind finished the argument. He put the hand she hadn't been able to see flat on the gravel roof, and it was empty. He said, I need a lawyer. That's the right call, she said. She moved to Reeves and found the cable tie, worked it against the pipe edge until it gave. It took 40 seconds, and her shoulder complained the entire time. And Reeves got his hands free and immediately reached for the man on the roof with the professional instinct of someone whose job was to secure people. Before she reminded him with a look that there was no threat left to contain, Reeves stopped, rubbed his wrists. "How'd you know I looked at the camera?" he said. "Because you're going to be good at this job," she said. "I told you." He looked at her. Then he almost smiled, which pulled at the bruising on his jaw and made him wince. The roof door opened, and 2 federal agents came through at a controlled run. The next 3 hours happened in layers. Parker debriefed her on the roof while agents processed the man, whose name turned out to be Philip Strand, who had been senior compliance director at Harlow Valley for 6 years, which explained the institutional fluency and the access to secure internal communications. Strand began talking before his lawyer arrived, which his lawyer would later describe as a significant error, and which produced a chain of information that moved outward from the hospital like something cracking through ice. Emily called at some point. Nora didn't remember exactly when. The timeline of the early morning had a compressed quality she recognized as the aftermath of sustained adrenaline, to say that federal agents had collected the drive from Nora's apartment and that it was intact, and that the 2 agents who'd gone dark briefly had been fine. A communications error. Nobody hurt. She said all of this in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady and not quite managing it. And Nora said she was glad and meant it. And Emily said, "You sound exhausted." And Nora said, "I know." And Emily said, "You're still not going to sleep, are you?" And Nora said, "Probably not yet." And Emily said a word that was not appropriate for the hospital environment and hung up. The drive contained what Nora had thought it contained. Parker told her this at around 4 in the morning, standing in a corridor outside a room that had been converted into a temporary federal processing space, with a cup of terrible coffee in one hand and the expression of someone who had confirmed a very large thing. 3 years, Parker said. The billing fraud goes back further than we thought. The network, Veriton Health Partners, the parent company, has tentacles in at least 4 other regional hospitals. Harlow Valley was the cleanest operation they ran, which is how it stayed under the radar as long as it did. She looked at Nora. Your compliance report 4 months ago triggered an alert in their system. That's what put you on Malone's radar. They created the performance file to build grounds for termination, Nora said. Before the federal investigation widened enough to include the hospital. Yes. Parker drank her coffee. They needed you out before your documentation became part of a federal case. 3 weeks, Nora said. The performance review was 3 weeks out. You had 3 weeks. Parker set the cup down. The hostage situation accelerated their timeline. When the FBI moved on the witness, they had to move on you simultaneously or lose the window. Nora thought about that. She thought about the specific arbitrariness of timing, that the entire chain of events had depended on a witness being placed in a specific hospital, in a specific bay, on a specific shift, where a specific nurse was working who had documentation that connected to the same network. The variables were improbable enough to be uncomfortable. Strand, she said, what's his involvement? He sanitized the billing records and managed the internal communication channels. He didn't know about the witness or the tactical operation. Malone kept those separate. Strand found out what was happening tonight when Malone called him from the server room. Parker paused. He panicked. Reeves was convenient. He wasn't sophisticated enough to make Reeves disappear. He was buying time hoping something would resolve. Yes. Parker looked at her. You read him, right? I read patience, Nora said. Same thing, mostly. At 5:47 in the morning, while the sun was doing something orange and indifferent above the east parking structure, Nora sat in a break room on the second floor and ate a granola bar that tasted like compressed cardboard and felt like the best thing she'd eaten in weeks. Her phone had 32 unread messages. She had read none of them. She was going to get to them in order of importance, which she would determine after she finished the granola bar. The door opened and Dr. Amara Osei came in. Osei was the cardiologist who had come down to find out who caught Gerald Pruitt's LAD blockage the previous morning, which was now almost exactly 24 hours ago, which felt impossible. She was small and precise in her movements, in her late 40s, and she had the specific quality of attention that good specialists developed. The ability to look at something and see it rather than look at it and see their expectations. She sat down across from Nora without asking. I heard what happened, Osei said. Some of it. The official version is still being constructed, apparently. It's complicated. I heard the unofficial version from Danny Reeves, who is a very talkative person when he's had 2 hours to process something. She paused. He said you took down 4 armed men with a trauma shears and a ceiling. 3.5. The leader surrendered. Yes, he mentioned that. Osi looked at her steadily. I also heard about the billing compliance report you filed 4 months ago. And what happened to it? Nora ate the last of the granola bar. Hartman, Osei said. The charge nurse. She's in federal custody. I know. Osei stopped, started again. I worked alongside her for 6 years. I referred cases to her. I trusted her read on the floor because she had institutional knowledge, and I didn't always have time to... She put her hands flat on the table. You reported something and she buried it, and then she built a case against you to remove you from the floor before you reported again. Yes. And I never noticed. There was something in the way she said it that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite apology. More like the specific discomfort of a person who had been inside a system and not seen what the system was doing and was now revising what that meant about their own perception. You were looking at your patients, Nora said. That's not a failure. I dismissed you, Osei said. Not directly. But I know what the floor culture was. Crawford sets the tone and the rest of us accommodate it because it's easier, and She stopped again. I should have pushed back on that a long time ago. Nora looked at her. She thought about the things she could say, the reassuring things, the collegial things, the things that would make this conversation easier for both of them. She thought about whether she wanted to say them. Yeah, she said. You should have. Osei absorbed that, nodded once, tight. For what it's worth, Osei said, every note in your performance file is being pulled for review by the hospital board as of an hour ago. The federal investigator requested it. She met Nora's eyes. They're going to find what they find. I know what they'll find. So do I. Osei stood. Gerald Pruitt is asking about you. He wants to thank you personally. She paused at the door. He said, and I'm quoting, that little blonde nurse saved my life and nobody even knows her name. She left. Nora sat in the break room for another minute. Then she got up, poured herself water from the tap because the coffee machine was not worth the effort, and went to find Gerald Pruitt. He was in the cardiac recovery suite on the 3rd floor, hooked to a monitor and propped at an angle that suggested the nursing staff had lost an argument with him about lying flat. He was 62, heavy-set, with the red face of a man who had spent his life outdoors. And when Nora came in, he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had been told a story they weren't sure they believed and was now seeing the evidence in person. You're smaller than I thought, he said. People say that. The nurses told me what happened downstairs. He looked at his hands, then at her. You caught my heart, and then you went and cleared the building. Different shifts, she said. He almost laughed, which turned into a wince from the procedure sites. I want you to know, he said. My daughter is trying to find out who to talk to, about making sure people know what you did. I appreciate that. It's not necessary. Maybe not necessary, he said, but correct. He held out his hand. Gerald Pruitt, retired contractor, currently alive because of you. She shook his hand. Nora Voss, nurse. He held on to the handshake a second longer than usual. Just nurse? Just nurse, she said. She left him to his recovery and went back down the stairs. The federal investigation made its first public moves at 8 in the morning. Nora wasn't watching the news. She was sitting in a trauma bay chair with a different medic doing a proper reassessment of her ribs, which had deteriorated from probably cracked to definitively cracked, and now had a companion bruise across the shoulder blade that had developed opinions overnight. The medic was methodical and professional and was trying very hard not to show that he was also deeply curious about how she had acquired these injuries, which she appreciated. Harker came in while the assessment was ongoing, looked at the medical situation, and chose to respect it by standing in the doorway instead of interrupting. Malone is being transferred to federal detention, Harker said to the room generally. Strand is cooperating in exchange for consideration on the charges. We've executed search warrants on Veritan Health Partners' administrative offices in 3 cities. How much of it connects? Nora said, without moving because the medic needed her still. Enough. Harker paused. Malone is talking too, not cooperating. He's not there yet, but talking in the way people talk when they're calculating what information is worth what protection. He confirmed that Sylvia Hartman was recruited by him directly. She managed the floor-level documentation, made sure the billing irregularities were attributed to individual nursing errors when they were flagged internally, and built cases against any staff member who looked too closely. The written warning, Nora said, was specifically designed to preempt any credibility claim you might make during a federal investigation. If you were under disciplinary review when the case broke, your documentation would have been easier to challenge. Harker looked at the floor for a moment. She did it to 2 other nurses before you. 1 transferred out of the department. 1 resigned. Nora thought about this. About the 2 other people who had noticed something and been systematically removed before they could become a problem. About how clean that process had been, how invisible, how neatly it had been made to look like performance management rather than suppression. I need their names, Nora said. The other 2 nurses. For what? Because if their personnel files look like mine, they deserve the same review. Harker looked at her. I'll get them. The medic finished the assessment, taped her ribs for the second time in 12 hours, noted the shoulder, gave her instructions she was going to follow about 60% of, and left. Nora sat in the trauma bay and heard the hospital around her resuming, slowly, unevenly, with the particular awkwardness of a place that had been through something acute and was now navigating the transition back to ordinary function. Gurneys moving, phones ringing, someone in the corridor arguing about a medication schedule. The ER was reopening to non-emergency intake. Life insisting. Crawford came in at 9. He looked worse than he had the previous evening, which was saying something, because he had looked bad then. He had not gone home. He was in the same clothes, his collar open, the careful assembly of his professional presentation visibly fraying at every edge. He stood inside the trauma bay door and looked at Nora as if he was resolving to do something he'd been working up to for a while. I spoke to the board's emergency liaison this morning, he said, at their request, about the department culture. He stopped. About my role in it. Nora waited. I've been doing this for 22 years, Crawford said. I have a specific way I run a floor, and I've always justified it as clinical efficiency, speed of decision, minimizing noise in the diagnostic process. He looked at his hands. What I was actually doing was deciding who was worth listening to before they finished speaking. It was not an elegant confession. It was the kind of thing people said when they'd been sitting with something uncomfortable for several hours and had finally decided that continuing to sit with it was worse than saying it. You almost missed the LAD blockage, Nora said. I know. Gerald Pruitt would have been discharged and dead in his car in the parking garage. I know. He met her eyes. I know. She looked at him for a moment. He was imperfect and defensive and had spent 22 years treating competence as a hierarchy where he stood at the top, and none of that was going to be undone by one conversation in a trauma bay after a bad night. She was not going to tell him otherwise. Don't do it again, she said. I won't. I mean the whole thing, not just the patient presentations, all of it. He nodded. It was a small nod, slightly stiff, but it was not a performed nod. She believed it had the weight of someone who had actually reached a decision rather than a social reflex. He left. She sat for another moment, alone in the trauma bay with the sounds of the ER resuming around her, and felt the strange specific exhaustion of a night that had been many things and was only now admitting it was over. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A news alert. The headline was 3 sentences. Federal agents execute search warrants in Harlow Valley Medical Center, billing fraud investigation. Chief Operations Officer Garrett Malone among 4 arrested. Investigation linked to regional healthcare networks spanning multiple states. Below the headline, the article was already generating. She could see the words billing fraud, patient data, witness protection breach, ongoing investigation. She could see the name Harlow Valley in text that was going to be read by people who had never heard of it before this morning. She put the phone down. She was still looking at the wall when Harker appeared in the doorway one final time, and the expression on Harker's face was not the careful professional neutrality she had maintained through the night. It was something else, something that had the quality of news arriving ahead of its context. Voss, Harker said. What? Warren Saul, the federal witness. He's in Bay 7. Nora felt the familiar clarifying shift at the back of her skull. Threat assessment, automatic. He was moved back for observation, Harker said. His wound has been stable. Vitals were normal 2 hours ago. She paused. 20 minutes ago, they stopped being normal. Nora was already standing. The attending on call flagged a sudden cardiac event, Harker said. No prior indication. His IV line was changed during shift handover. Another pause. Longer. The nurse who changed it can't be located. She didn't run. Running was for people who hadn't learned that speed without control was just a faster way to make the wrong decision. She moved fast. Fast enough that the medic who'd just finished her reassessment had to step back to avoid being walked through. And she was thinking the entire time, building the picture from what Harker had said. Sudden cardiac event, no prior indication, IV line changed during shift handover, attending nurse missing. Not a cardiac event, a cardiac attack. There was a difference, and the difference was intent. Bay 7 was through the main ER corridor, and she covered the distance in under a minute, pushing past 2 federal agents who started to object and then looked at Harker, who was 2 steps behind Nora and made a gesture that resolved the objection. The bay was controlled chaos. The specific density of a resuscitation in progress, bodies positioned correctly, the crash cart open, the attending physician calling rhythm assessments in the flat, authoritative voice of someone running a code. The monitor showed ventricular fibrillation, not the dramatic flat line of television, but the chaotic, shivering line of a heart that had lost its organized signal and was running on electrical noise. Warren Saul was on the gurney, gray-faced, not conscious. VFib, 60 seconds since last shock, the attending said. He was young, mid-30s, competent, doing everything correctly. He looked up when Nora came in and started to speak. The IV line, Nora said. Is it out? We pulled it when... Where is it? One of the nurses held it up in a sealed bag. She had already bagged it, which was either instinct or someone had told her to, and Nora didn't care which. She was already looking at the bag. Clear line, standard gauge, and at the injection port a faint residue she couldn't identify visually, but whose presence told her what she needed to know. What was his potassium level on the last draw? She said. The attending checked the chart. 4.1. Normal. Run it again, now. And get me magnesium sulfate and lidocaine ready, because this is not idiopathic VFib. She moved to the gurney and looked at Saul. His color, his muscle tone, the specific pattern of the arrhythmia on the monitor. Someone pushed potassium chloride through that line. High concentration, fast bolus. It disrupts the cardiac membrane potential. You get VFib within minutes, it looks like spontaneous cardiac arrest, and by the time the talk screen comes back, the line is gone, and the nurse who changed it is gone, and you're writing cause of death as cardiac event in a man who had a gunshot wound 2 days ago. The attending looked at her, then at the monitor, then back. You're sure? Run the potassium and prove me wrong, she said. In the meantime, treat it like hyperkalemic VFib. Calcium gluconate first. It stabilizes the membrane. Then sodium bicarb to shift the potassium. Shock him again after the calcium has 60 seconds to work. That's not the standard sequence for... I know what the standard sequence is. She looked at him directly. I'm telling you why this one is different. You can follow the standard sequence and watch him not respond and figure it out in 4 minutes, or you can trust the differential and get ahead of it now. The attending held her gaze for exactly as long as it took to make the decision. Calcium gluconate, he said. 10 mils IV push. Now. The nurse moved. Nora moved with her, not taking over. This was not her resuscitation to run. She was a resource, not the authority, and she understood the difference, but staying close enough to catch anything the team might miss in the pressure of the moment. 60 seconds after the calcium went in, the attending shocked him again. The monitor shivered, stabilized. Sinus rhythm. Not clean, not normal, but organized. The room exhaled. The potassium level came back 11 minutes later at 7.8 milliequivalents per liter. Normal was under 5. The attending looked at the result and then looked at Nora with the expression of someone recalibrating something they thought they understood about the world. How did you know? He said. The timing, she said. VFib in a patient with stable post-op vitals and normal labs 2 hours prior doesn't come from nowhere. And the nurse who changed the line being unavailable wasn't a coincidence. It was a plan. She looked at the monitor where Saul's rhythm was holding. Someone in this network had one more move. They couldn't get to him upstairs, so they waited for the building to reopen and used the shift handover, the gap between one nurse leaving and another establishing the patient, to push the line. Harker had been standing at the bay entrance during all of this. She was on the phone now, moving fast, the specific compressed urgency of someone executing multiple simultaneous instructions. She caught Nora's eye and held up one finger, 1 minute, and kept moving. Nora turned back to Saul. He was still unconscious, but his pressure was coming up, and the monitor was holding its rhythm with the determined stubbornness of a heart that had been given a reason to keep going. She checked his pupils, his color, the quality of his breathing. Not out of crisis yet, but moving in the right direction. She had a thought, and the thought was simple and tired. He had come to this hospital as a wounded man with a secret that powerful people wanted buried, and in the last 16 hours she had kept him alive twice. Once from the gunmen who came for him, and once from the poison that came after. She did not know what he knew, or what it was worth, or whether the federal case built around his testimony would amount to anything that looked like justice. She only knew that keeping people alive was the work, and she had done it, and that was something she could hold on to regardless of what else happened. The attending finished his documentation and looked at her again. "You need to be on this floor," he said, "permanently. I work the ER. Not anymore from what I hear." He said it carefully, not unkindly, the way people said things that were true but complicated. Word gets around fast in a building this size. She didn't answer that. She went to find Harker. Harker was in the corridor outside, phone down, talking to 2 agents and a woman in a dark blazer who had the specific bearing of someone senior enough that other people stood slightly differently when she was in the room. Harker saw Nora coming and made introductions with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for preamble. "Nora Voss, this is Deputy Director Lena Farrow, FBI Field Office." Farrow was in her late 50s, with gray in her hair and the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority. She looked at Nora the way Osei had looked at Gerald Pruitt's chart, actually looking, not confirming what she expected to see. "Nurse Voss," Farrow said, "Deputy Director. I've been briefed on the last 18 hours, in some detail." She paused. "I've also been briefed on the IV line situation just now. Harker tells me you identified the mechanism and directed the treatment. I made a differential. The attending ran the code. The attending confirms that your differential was correct and that it saved the witness's life." Farrow's expression was measured. "That's the second time in 18 hours. "I know." Farrow looked at her for another moment. "The nurse who changed the line has been identified. She was hired 6 weeks ago through a staffing agency that we are now discovering has connections to Veritan Health Partners. She was placed here specifically. We have her on camera leaving the building during the power cut." She paused. "She's in custody as of 40 minutes ago." The completeness of that, the last piece of the network's access to the hospital closed off, settled over Nora with a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "The documentation from your drive," Farrow continued, "combined with Saul's testimony and Strand's cooperation, gives us a federal case with teeth in 4 jurisdictions. The Veritan Partners operation has been running for 9 years, 6 hospitals, estimated fraud of somewhere between $40 and $60 million across that period." She let that number exist in the air for a moment. "Your compliance report from 4 months ago was the first flag that cracked the administrative layer. Without it, we would have been looking for a much longer time." Nora thought about filing that report. She thought about the form response she had received and the silence after, and the way she had assumed, reasonably, that it had been buried and forgotten. She thought about the specific particular loneliness of doing the right thing in a context that seemed designed to make the right thing irrelevant. "It didn't feel like much at the time," she said. "It rarely does," Farrow said. "That's usually how it works." At 11 in the morning, the hospital board convened an emergency session. Nora knew about it because Harker told her, and she knew the outcome because Harker's assistant came to find her in the break room where she was on her 3rd cup of coffee and her 2nd hour of sitting still. The board had voted unanimously to place Dr. Ramsey Crawford on administrative review, pending the investigation of the department's clinical culture. The vote on Sylvia Hartman was moot. She was in federal custody. But the board had formally referred her personnel file to the investigative team and issued a public statement acknowledging the department's systemic failures. Both of the other nurses Harker had identified, the ones who had noticed billing irregularities before Nora, who had been systematically removed through the same manufactured performance process, were contacted by the board's legal team before noon. Their personnel files were flagged for the same review as Nora's. One of them, a woman named Petra Solano, who had resigned and left nursing entirely, agreed to speak with investigators. The formal statement about Nora's own personnel file came at 12:30. Every disciplinary notation, every written warning, every marginal performance assessment that Sylvia Hartman had constructed over 2 years was pulled, reviewed by 2 independent clinical assessors, and expunged. The word the board used in the written notification was expunged. Not reversed, not reconsidered, but removed entirely, as if the record had never contained it. Which was, Nora thought, the appropriate level of thoroughness. She read the notification twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to check on Gerald Pruitt. He was sitting up and eating lunch with the specific determined enthusiasm of a man who understood viscerally that the ability to eat lunch was not something to take for granted. He looked up when she came in and pointed at the chair with his fork. "Sit," he said. "I've been thinking." She sat. "My daughter found the news," he said. "The billing fraud story. Your name is in it." He watched her. "You knew about this before last night." "I suspected it for 18 months. I had documentation for 4. And they tried to fire you for it." "They tried to build the case to fire me for it," she said. "There's a small difference." He chewed, considered. "You kept coming to work." "Yes." "Every day, knowing they were building a case against you." "There wasn't another option that made sense to me," she said. "The patients were still here. The billing fraud was still happening. Leaving wasn't going to fix either of those things." Gerald looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent his life in a trade where you either showed up and did the work or you didn't, and who recognized something familiar in the logic. "My daughter wants to write a letter to the board," he said, "about you specifically. I told her to write 2. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to." He pointed at her with the fork again. "That's the thing about gratitude. It's not about need." She let him write the letters. Garrett Malone was transferred to federal detention at 2 in the afternoon. The transfer was not quiet. There were cameras outside the federal building, the kind that appeared when a story had enough weight to pull news teams away from their usual rotations. The image that ran on the evening news and repeated for days after was specific. Malone in a gray suit that had been handsome 12 hours ago, his hands secured, his face doing nothing in particular, which was somehow more damning than any expression would have been. The blankness of a man who had decided the performance was over. Sylvia Hartman's arrest had been earlier, less public, but the details that emerged were more personal and in some ways harder to look at. She had been at Harlow Valley for 11 years. She had run a tight floor with real competence. She had also, for at least 5 of those years, known exactly what the billing fraud was and had chosen to protect it because protecting it protected her position and her income and her authority over a floor that she had come to think of as entirely her domain. She had not initiated the fraud. She had maintained the conditions that allowed it to continue undetected, and when those conditions were threatened by nurses who looked too closely, she had used her authority to remove them. The federal charge was obstruction and conspiracy, and it carried the weight both words implied. Nora heard about the charges from Emily, who had come back to the hospital in the early afternoon because, as she explained, she didn't know what else to do with herself and the hospital was where she worked, and it seemed wrong to just not be there. "How do you feel about it?" Emily asked. "The charges. They were in the break room. Emily had brought food from outside, actual food, the kind that required a bag and came warm, and had set it on the table between them with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who considered feeding people a primary response to crisis. "I don't know," Nora said. "I've been thinking about that question and I keep coming back to the same place. Which is? That what I feel about it isn't the important part." She pulled the bag toward her. "Gerald Pruitt is alive. Warren Saul is alive. 2 nurses who lost their careers to a manufactured disciplinary process are getting reviewed. Those are the things that matter. Emily watched her. You're allowed to also care about what happened to you. I know. I mean it. The performance file, the 2 years of being treated like you were invisible, you're allowed to be angry about that. Nora opened the bag. It smelled like something with garlic and something with rice, and she realized she had not eaten a real meal in over 24 hours. I'm not angry, she said. Not even a little? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Not in the way you mean, she said. I think I'm something else, something that doesn't have a clean name. I came here 2 years ago and I buried half of what I was because I thought that was what the work required. And then a building full of armed men showed up, and the half I buried turned out to be exactly what the work required. And I don't know yet what to do with that. Emily was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? She said. After. When this is all... She gestured vaguely at the general concept of the situation. Processed. Keep working. Here. Maybe. Nora looked at the break room. The coffee machine, the corkboard with its outdated announcements, the window looking out at the parking structure. The ordinary accumulated texture of a place you'd spent 2 years. Maybe not exactly here. There's going to be an offer, Emily said. I heard something from Rosario. Rosario hears everything. She does. And what she heard was that Deputy Director Farrow had a conversation with the hospital board about establishing a specialized unit, patient safety, internal compliance, trauma support, someone who understands the clinical floor and the administrative structure and the places where those two things stop talking to each other in ways that allow fraud to survive. Emily looked at her. They want to offer you the lead. Nora ate her rice. Is that a no? Emily said. It's a not yet, she said. I need to sleep first. Emily accepted this. She ate her own food. Outside, through the break room window, the afternoon was doing something pale and unremarkable with the light, and the parking structure was filling back up as the hospital returned to its routines. And somewhere above them, Warren Saul was in cardiac recovery, and Danny Reeves was being evaluated for a concussion he'd been ignoring, and Gerald Pruitt was on the phone with his daughter, reading her the draft of the letter she was going to send to the board. Nora said. What? Thank you for the text messages. Last night. Your cousin's location data. Emily shrugged, in the way people shrugged when they were trying to make something feel smaller than it was. You would have figured it out. Maybe, but you helped. That's what people are supposed to do, Emily said. Help. It was such a simple sentence. Nora sat with it for a moment, the way you sat with things that were simple but had weight behind them. 3 weeks later, the courtroom footage played on every news outlet that covered federal criminal proceedings, which turned out to be most of them. Garrett Malone entered a guilty plea to federal fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 3 counts related to the witness protection breach. His attorney had negotiated a cooperation agreement that reduced the ceiling on his sentence in exchange for testimony against the senior Veritan Partners executives, and the agreement required him to stand in open court and confirm, on the record, the full scope of what the billing operation had been and what he had done to maintain it. He did it in the flat, factual voice of a man who had made a calculation and was executing it. He named names. He confirmed dates. He described the mechanism by which patient data had been sold, the methodology of the billing manipulation, the process by which staff who noticed too much were identified and removed. He named Nora Voss specifically, 3 times, as an employee who had correctly identified the fraud and been deliberately targeted for elimination as a result. Sylvia Hartman did not take a plea. Her attorney signaled intent to contest the conspiracy charge on the grounds that her participation had been coerced by Malone's institutional authority over her career. Federal prosecutors indicated they were not persuaded by this argument and planned to proceed. Philip Strand cooperated fully. His testimony filled in the technical architecture of the billing system, the specific mechanisms of the fraud that no one else had been positioned close enough to describe. His cooperation agreement significantly reduced his exposure. His nursing license, which he had never actually had, was not a factor. The staffing agency nurse who had changed Warren Saul's IV line was charged with attempted murder. She had no cooperation agreement and no apparent intention of making one. Her trial date was set for 8 months out. The Veritan Partners executives, 4 of them, in 3 cities, were indicted on the same morning in coordinated federal actions. Their names ran in the news cycle for several days before being replaced by the next several things that required the news cycle's attention. The case itself would take years. Federal cases did. Nora followed the proceedings the way she followed most things, attentively, without drama, extracting what was relevant and filing the rest. She was not a person who needed to watch the dominoes fall in real time. She just needed to know they were falling. The formal review of her personnel file was completed 4 weeks after the hostage incident. The board's independent assessors produced a 40-page report that examined every disciplinary notation, every performance assessment, every marginal comment attached to her record, and found, systematically and in documented detail, that none of them met the clinical or professional standards required to constitute legitimate disciplinary action. The report used the phrase manufactured record 17 times. The board sent Nora a written apology. It was carefully worded, lawyers had been involved, but underneath the careful wording, if you read it the way Nora read things, it said what it meant. They had presided over a department that treated a qualified nurse as a problem to be managed rather than a professional to be supported, and that failure had created the conditions for fraud to survive undetected for 3 years, and they were sorry. She read it twice. She put it in a folder with her other documents, not because she planned to use it, but because she had learned over the last 2 years that documentation mattered. That writing things down was not paranoia but precision, that the record of what happened was the only thing that survived when people tried to rewrite it. The offer from the hospital board came in writing the same week, delivered by a board member named Tran, who had the direct, unsentimental manner of someone who preferred to say things once and mean them. The position was formally titled Patient Safety and Compliance Liaison, a new role, no existing template, salary 15% above her current nursing rate, authority to conduct independent reviews across all departments, direct reporting line to the board rather than to departmental administration. Nora read the offer letter. She thought about the 2 nurses who had come before her, Petra Solano, who had left the profession entirely, and a woman named Diane Marsh, who had transferred to a hospital in another state and was still working but had never filed another compliance report, which was its own kind of loss. She thought about the 3 years of fraud that had survived because the people who noticed it had been efficiently removed. She thought about what it would mean to have someone in the building whose explicit job was to be the person who noticed things and couldn't be removed for it. She accepted the offer. She negotiated one condition, that the role explicitly included mentorship access for nursing staff across all departments, a formal mechanism by which any nurse could raise a clinical or administrative concern without it traveling through the departmental hierarchy first. The board agreed. The announcement was made at an all-staff meeting on a Thursday morning, and Nora stood in the back of the room while it was read and felt the very specific discomfort of being publicly recognized in a building where she had spent 2 years being invisible. People looked at her. Some of them looked at her the way people looked at something they were recalibrating their understanding of. Some of them, the ones who had worked the floor, the night nurses, the nursing assistants, the medics who ran the ambulance bay, looked at her with something simpler and more direct. Danny Reeves was there, out of his officer's uniform and in plain clothes, his jaw fully bruised now in the spectacular way bruises developed 3 weeks out. He caught her eye across the room and gave her a nod that contained, she thought, approximately everything that needed to be said. Emily was next to her, and when the applause started, it was awkward applause, the kind that didn't know how loud to be. Emily put her elbow into Nora's arm. "You could smile," Emily said. "I'm thinking." "You're always thinking." "That's how I got here," Nora said. Emily laughed, small and real, and Nora almost smiled, which was, for Nora, essentially the same thing. Crawford found her after the meeting. He was alone, no performance in it, no audience, and he stopped her in the corridor with the slightly awkward physical hesitation of a man who had learned slowly and at some cost that direct was better than polished. "The board is restructuring the clinical oversight process," he said. "I'll be reporting to you on patient safety matters." "I know. I wanted to say, in person, not through a form, that I think it's the right call." She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell, the way she could tell most things about people. Not from any single signal, but from the accumulation of small ones, the way a diagnosis came together not from one symptom, but from the pattern. "Crawford," she said. "What?" "Gerald Pruitt went home yesterday." He blinked. Then something in his face shifted. Not the dramatic shift of televised redemption, but the small, quiet shift of a person receiving information that cost them something to receive. "Good," he said. "That's good." "He asked me to thank you," she said. "For the cardiac referral." Crawford looked at her for a moment. They both knew what she was doing, giving him a version of that morning that was more generous than the facts, letting him carry a better story into the work ahead. She had thought about whether to do it for several days and decided that the purpose wasn't to excuse what had happened, but to give him something to grow toward. He seemed to understand that. "I'll be better," he said. Not a promise with an audience, just a statement for the corridor between two people. "I know," she said. She went back to work. Warren Saul testified before the federal grand jury 6 weeks after his admission to Harlow Valley. His testimony, combined with Malone's cooperation, Strand's documentation, and the forensic analysis of Nora's compliance records, produced indictments against 11 individuals across 3 states and began the process. Long, grinding, imperfect, as federal proceedings always were, of dismantling the network that had operated invisibly inside 6 hospitals for nearly a decade. He called Nora once, from a number she didn't recognize, 3 days before the grand jury. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "Go ahead." "When they had me in Bay 7, before everything, I had made peace with the idea that I was going to die there. I was a liability, and I knew it, and the protection was thin, and I'd been watching the door for 2 days waiting for someone to come through it." She waited. "The first time I saw you," he said, "you were adjusting my IV line while someone was pointing a gun at the officer next to me, and you were doing it, adjusting the line, like it was the most normal thing in the world, like nothing was going to stop you from doing the thing that needed doing." She looked at the wall of her new office, small, crowded, the desk already covered in the documentation she was building for the first formal compliance review, which she had scheduled for the following Tuesday. "That's just the work," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I wanted to tell you. I know." Quote, 6 months after the night of the gunman, on a Tuesday evening when the work was done and the building was quiet, and the way buildings were quiet when they had returned, finally, to their purpose, Nora Voss sat at her desk and looked at the compliance report she was finishing. It was not dramatic work. It was meticulous and undramatic, and it required the kind of sustained attention that most people found difficult to maintain, and it was exactly what she was built for. She had found, in the months since the restructuring, that the work of seeing clearly, of looking at a system and finding where it was lying to itself, was not fundamentally different from looking at a patient. Both required you to set aside what you expected to find and look at what was actually there. Both required you to be willing to say the uncomfortable thing when the comfortable thing was wrong. She was not a hero. She had been told she was, in several forms and contexts, and she had accepted the word with the mild patience of someone who understood that people needed words for things and that hero was the word available, but it didn't describe the experience from the inside. From the inside, it had been, most of the time, just the next problem and the next decision and the ongoing question of what the work required. What she was, precise. Stubborn in the specific way of someone who had decided, at some point she could no longer identify, that accuracy was worth the cost of saying it. Good at the work, better at it than people had credited, for longer than she had been credited. She had been invisible because the system had needed her to be invisible in order to continue functioning the way it was functioning, and she had allowed the invisibility because she had believed, wrongly, that the work mattered more than being seen doing it. She had been wrong about that. Not because recognition was the point, it wasn't, but because the invisibility had allowed the fraud to continue, had allowed 2 other nurses to be pushed out of the profession, had allowed patients to be billed for procedures they never received, and data they never consented to share. The invisibility had not protected the work. It had protected the people who were corrupting it. She thought about this with some regularity. She thought about it the way she thought about most mistakes. Not with guilt, because guilt was not a useful clinical response, but with the intention to learn from it and adjust. She was visible now. She did not love it. She was doing it anyway. Her phone buzzed. Emily. You still in there? It's 7 p.m. She looked at the time. It was, in fact, 7 in the evening. She typed back, finishing a section. Emily. I'm in the break room. Rosario made something. Come eat. She looked at the report. She looked at the door. She thought about Rosario, who had locked down a floor and called her in the dark on a bad night, and then silently refilled her coffee and asked nothing in return except the information she needed to be useful. She saved the document and got up. The corridor outside her office was quiet, lit at the amber end of the day's light, and she walked through it toward the break room and the sound of two women arguing about whether the thing Rosario had made needed more salt, and the specific ordinariness of it, the normalcy of two people debating seasoning at the end of a shift, felt like something she hadn't known she needed. She pushed the door open. Finally, Emily said. I was working. You're always working. Emily slid a bowl across the table. Rosario made pozole. It doesn't need more salt. It needs a little more salt, Rosario said without looking up from her bowl. Nora sat down. She tasted it. She thought about saying something about the salt and decided against it because some things were not about being right. She ate. Outside, the hospital ran its routines. Monitors beeping, gurneys moving, the overnight staff beginning their rotations. The work of keeping people alive, continuing in the particular democratic way it always continued, without fanfare, without recognition, shift after shift after shift. She had been part of it for 2 years as a ghost and was now part of it as something else. Something she was still defining in the way you define things that didn't have existing templates. She thought about what she would tell someone if someone asked her what she had learned. She would tell them this. The quiet ones are not quiet because they have nothing to say. They are quiet because they have learned in various ways and at various costs that speaking is not always safe. And when the moment comes that requires them to speak, or to move, or to push a server rack off a wall with 2 cracked ribs at 3 a.m, they are ready in ways that the room could not have predicted because the room was not paying attention. The room should have been paying attention. That was the lesson, maybe. Not about heroism, not about hidden warriors or extraordinary women who reveal themselves in crisis. Something smaller and more durable than that. Pay attention to the people you're not paying attention to, because they are paying attention to everything. Nora finished her bowl. Rosario refilled it without asking. Emily was telling a story about something that had happened on the floor that afternoon. Something involving a medication cart and a miscommunication and an outcome that was ultimately fine but had been briefly alarming, and she was telling it the way Emily told everything, with her hands and her face and the full commitment of someone for whom the world was endlessly, exhaustingly interesting. Nora listened. She ate. She was for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, not preparing for the next thing. She was just here. And for now, for this hour, in this break room with cold tile floors and a coffee machine that was barely worth the effort, and 2 women who had shown up for her in the dark when showing up was not simple, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything the work was supposed to be.